Shalom Alechem, peace be with you, my friends, and welcome back to the Jesus Way podcast. Today we are joined again by returning guest, good friend of ours, and fellow NASDOG, Mr. David Natsori. Thank you again for joining us on the podcast today, brother.
Oh, glad to be here.
So we're going to be talking today with David about another niche topic in the Paul universe, which is the whole topic of James versus Paul. Now, we did a podcast with you about 6 months ago now, the 7 things Jesus warned us about Paul.
Right.
And that has been one of our most watched, maybe our most watched episode to date, with about 125K views at this point. And so we wanted to bring you back on for a part 2, but specifically to discuss the angle of James versus Paul. Now, for me personally, this is one of my favorite topics to study when it comes to the great schism between Paul and the Jesus movement. Because simply the proof of James's contentions with Paul is very apparent in not just Paul's own letters and the book of Acts and the Nazarene Acts, but as we're going to see today, and you're going to unpack for us, the epistle of James, Jesus' own brother. So David's going to walk us through a presentation he's put together with some slides that show that the epistle of James, a lot of the epistle of James, is a response to some of Paul's letters and teachings, and that it shows very early evidence of this schism between Paul and Jesus' own brothers and disciples. Now, most of you guys who watch this podcast are well aware that James chapter 2 is a clear refutation of Paul's writing in Romans 3, where Paul's using the example of Abraham offering his son as a sacrifice as proof that we're justified by God through faith alone, apart from works. And then James responds to that in verse 20, saying, "Do you want to be shown, O vain man, that faith without works is dead?" And he goes on to use the same analogy as Paul, which is kind of the smoking gun, right? And he concludes that it was because Abraham was actually about to go through with it that he was justified, showing that it's really works with faith, right? And so apologists have done all kinds of mental gymnastics to avoid this obvious refutation of Paul from Jesus' brother. But I just point out that, even the father of Protestant Christianity, Martin Luther, fully acknowledged this schism, and that James is here refuting Paul in chapter 2. And Martin Luther wrote in one of his letters saying, "Many sweat hard at reconciling James with Paul, but unsuccessfully, because faith justifies in Romans 3:28 stands in flat contradiction to faith does not justify in James 2:24. And then he says, if anyone can harmonize these sayings, I'll put my doctor's cap on him and let him call me a fool." So even Martin Luther didn't think that this was a harmonizable passage here in James chapter 2. So there's just really no good arguments to be made that James is not refuting Paul, even that he clearly calls Paul a vain man in this passage. But in any case, David is going to walk us through many more proofs in the epistle of James today like this. And we're going to look at also what the Nazarene Christians wrote about their history with Paul, which is quite scandalous, to say the least, if you're a Christian. They have these multiple attestations and sources that Saul of Tarsus actually attempted to kill James, or maybe was even involved in his stoning under Ananias in 64 CE. And this was just one of the many ugly facts about Paul that the book of Acts is trying to cover up, along with his total rejection by the disciples and the Jerusalem church. So we're going to look at all these topics and more today on our episode today with David. But I wanted to pitch to you, James, because you had something you wanted to say that I think is a really important point. We really, with anytime we talk about Paul, we should bring this up, but especially as it pertains to this episode.
Yeah, we understand how this is a sensitive topic for Christians and how attached people can be to the words and dogma of Paul. I mean, me and myself have been inspired by some verses from Paul, putting on the armor of God and whatnot. But really, I think deep down, the attachment to Paul stems from a beautiful archetype of the sinner being redeemed, someone who's lost in wickedness, repenting sincerely, and actually becoming an agent of God. That's a beautiful archetype that we could all resonate with. All of us have sinned, all of us have fallen, and we want to be forgiven and used for good, just like Paul was, right? So that archetype that theme can still be true and as relevant as ever today with all of us and throughout history, and not necessarily apply to Paul. Because there's, David, as you said before, you judge a tree by its fruit. And there's key distinctions where Paul goes against Jesus and against James. So that's basically what I wanted to set the framework with. We got to put these attachments to certain ideas to the side and look at the evidence objectively. And when we do that, we'll see very clearly that Paul went astray and has led all of Christianity in a different direction than it was originally intended.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's a big love affair that people have with Paul, particularly in the Protestant church. You know, Protestants will judge the Catholics for their veneration of Mary and the way that the Catholics will worship Mary and call her like this co-redeemer with Jesus and such. But in reality, Protestants do the same thing with Paul. You know, they're guilty of the same thing. They'll tell you that, oh, well, you can't be saved by Jesus. You have to accept Paul. If you don't accept Paul, you're not saved. And I've been told that. I couldn't even tell you how many times I've been told that.
And not only that, David, they'll refute Jesus with Paul.
Oh, yeah.
So it's really making Paul the ultimate authority, which is on the Jesus Way podcast. All we're saying is that Jesus is the highest authority. The words of Jesus and the history of the early Christian movement, that is the authority, not the tradition and dogma of the church that's based on the teachings of Paul.
Yeah, I have a Sunday church that I go to sometimes, and there's this old family friend. It's a man I used to be in business with my father, and he came and was talking to me one day, and he was like, "So why don't you just go ahead and join the church? Like you just kind of come occasionally." And I said, "Well, I don't agree with the church theologically." And he's like, "Well, what do you disagree with?" And he probably regrets asking that
Oh
now.
boy.
But one of the things I said was I don't believe Paul is a legitimate apostle. And he was like, "Well, just tell me this: do you believe that you're saved by works or by faith, by grace through
Wow.
faith?" And I said, "Oh, I believe what Jesus said, that we're saved by works." And the look on his face, you would have thought that I just I don't know, was worshiping the devil or something.
You grew a witch nose, yeah.
Yeah, no. But I mean, that's what Jesus taught. He taught, well, like in the parable of the sheep and the goats. He has the sheep on one side and the goats on the other, and the sheep are saved because they had works. You know, they clothed the naked and fed the hungry and visited those that were sick and were in prison. And then it was the opposite for the goats. They didn't do works, so they were consigned to the fire. So, you know, Jesus taught works consistently all through the Gospels. He didn't teach faith alone.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, just think about what an insane inversion it is. You know, the darkness, the negative polarity always thrives on inverting truth. I grew up in church as well that would use that term like a dirty word. Like, oh, that's works. Oh, come on, man, that's works. Get those works-based teachings out of here. And it's like, wait, slow down. Listen to the words coming out of your mouth.
yeah.
Oh, works. Ah. Wait, good works is to you? Do you think maybe you've trailed off a bit from the path of truth if good works is now a bad term in your religion? It is crazy to unpack it and like look at the psychological inversions that happen in these thought systems.
Well, I've made the joke before that, you know, Christians don't know what the word not means when he says mercy, not sacrifice. But I tell you what, you put the word not in front of works, they absolutely know what it means.
It's so true.
There's no confusion there at all. They suddenly understand the vocabulary perfectly.
I love what Douglas Del Tondo says. You know, Paul's like, you know, so no man should boast. It's faith alone, not works. So no man should boast. Douglas Del Tondo's like, well, don't boast then. Just do good works and don't brag about it.
Dude,
Yeah.
Paul saying don't boast is got to be the most ironic, hilarious thing ever for somebody who never stops talking about themselves. Because of the surpassing greatness of my revelations, the Lord gave me a thorn in the flesh to keep me from being conceited. It's like, well, it looks like you didn't succeed on that one, Paul.
Yeah, if
So in any
that was the
case,
point, he totally it didn't work.
yeah, Jesus failed on that one too, I guess.
Yeah.
So why don't you go ahead and share some slides with us, David, and we'll go through your presentation here. Have you ever dreamed of being an author and making a real living writing about the topics that you're most passionate about? Well, now that reality is more possible than ever. The traditional model of write a book, hand it to a publisher or Amazon, and collect a royalty, that model is broken. And I say this as a published author who learned this the hard way. I published a book last year and watched Amazon pocket most of the money while keeping all my readers behind their walled garden. But my good friend and fellow Nazarene, Scott Shepard, has uncovered a new business model for writers. Scott has written a new book titled Penpreneur, How to Make Six Figures Writing One Thing a Month. And this book teaches you how this new business model works. This book normally retails for $25, but for the viewers of the Jesus Way podcast, Scott's going to be gifting this book for free because we want more people writing about all the topics we cover on this podcast. So all you have to pay for is the $4.95 to cover the shipping. So you can get your free copy of Penpreneur by going to JesusWayDiscount.com, or you can scan the QR code on the screen and get started today earning a living writing about the subjects that you love. And now, back to the show.
All right. So this is the breakdown that I personally see going on in Acts 15 and Galatians 2, and it's kind of like this summary of events. So Paul goes to Jerusalem. Now in Galatians, he says, "Oh, I went up there by revelation," but in Acts, he's told to go there so that they can figure out this. There's a matter of contention, and the way it's described in Acts is whether you have to be circumcised to be saved or not. But then by the end of Acts 15, it appears the real issue is whether you have to be circumcised to just get into the synagogue. So I think there's some obfuscation about what the exact problem is. What is the disagreement exactly? But either way, in this Acts 15 conference, he meets with the apostles and the elders. Circumcision is discussed. And there's a discussion about offerings. According to Galatians 2, Paul says, they tell me all that we have to do is remember the poor. And that's generally thought to mean remember to give offerings to the poor. Instructions are given to trusted messengers. By the way, the trusted messengers is not Paul. They sent two men with Paul to deliver the message because apparently there was some type of a trust issue going on. Silas and Judas, I believe, is who they sent. So Paul
doesn't
goes
it
back
actually say, David? Doesn't it say we'll send our trusted messengers
Yes.
and Paul and Barnabas?
Right. Yeah, two messengers that we trust to they would give their life for the faith. So obviously they didn't feel that way about Paul.
You can almost imagine they're all standing around and James is like, we're going to send our two trusted messengers, and Paul and Barnabas start to glow like, oh yeah. And then he's like, and Paul and Barnabas can go too.
Yeah.
It's like, oh.
Well, I think it's funny too, because people will say like, oh, well, Paul went to Jerusalem and he met with the apostles and elders, so they approved of him. But it doesn't say they approved of him. It just said that they listened to what he had to say. And that was it.
Right.
Paul says they gave me the right hand of fellowship. Well, I go to the church I mentioned earlier. It's a Church of God, and I went in there and about 3 weeks ago, and the pastor was rearranging the chairs, and I was walking past him, and he stopped and he shook my hand. So guys, as of that time, I'm now an approved preacher for the Church of God. I can go anywhere, and they automatically accept all of my doctrine.
Yeah, man.
Oh, and
the moment he shook your hand, he was saying that I agree with everything that David believes.
Right. So,
obviously.
and if I go into some other Church of God and I want to get up and preach, they're not going to ask me for letters of recommendation because 2 Corinthians says that's bad, right? They gave me the right hand of fellowship. Yeah, I already have it. It would be legalism to ask for a letter of recommendation. So anyway, instructions are given to the trusted messengers, and then Paul goes back to Antioch with the messengers. Now, I believe it's at this point, as sometime, I have it in parentheses here, Paul writes First Corinthians. This is the point in time that I think it was written. At some point, Peter comes to Antioch. So, now Peter's in Antioch with Paul. But then people arrive in Antioch that were sent by James. And I personally believe there's a good chance they showed up in Antioch with a copy of First Corinthians, because there's something that these men from James say to Peter that causes Peter to withdraw from table fellowship. And Paul kind of dances around the issue, but he doesn't really tell you what it is. So this causes a disagreement between Peter and Paul. Paul obviously loses the disagreement because he admits that everybody turned against him. The men sent from James were against him. Peter was against him. Even Barnabas turned against him. So obviously Paul lost the disagreement. Whatever it was, Paul ended up getting rebuked. Now he obfuscates that in his letter. He tries to, in a very prideful manner, acts like he was the one that was in the right, but that's debatable. It's at this point, according to both Acts and Galatians 2, that Paul and Barnabas part ways. And then at some point after that, Paul writes Galatians and 2 Corinthians. And then there's this letter of James. And I believe that the letter of James is a response from James specifically to both Galatians and 2 Corinthians. So
interesting. Can I ask you a question, David?
Yeah.
So there's kind of two camps on Acts in scholarship. One camp would say that Acts doesn't know Paul's letters because it contradicts them so flagrantly.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's some other good evidence that Acts may know Paul's letters. And there may even be multiple authors of Acts, so who knows? But are you in the camp that says that Acts doesn't know Paul's letters on that?
I don't know that I'm really squarely in either camp. I don't see Acts as being historically accurate. It's obviously written by whoever wrote Acts, whether it's Luke or someone else, is obviously like a fanboy of Paul. So throughout the book of Acts, if whatever Paul does, Paul does the greatest that anyone's ever done it. And so I don't believe for 1 minute that it's historically accurate. It's very biased.
Yeah.
I do think there's probably an element of truth in some of it. So I don't necessarily think that it's all false. Like it talks about the Acts 15 conference, there probably was some type of meeting. Now, whether it's accurately, presented, that's another story. It's like what I was mentioning earlier about how at the beginning of Acts 15, it's all about being circumcised to be saved. But at the end of Acts 15, it appears to be more about what do you have to do to be able to come into the congregation, which is kind of two different issues. Like, I think somebody was objecting to uncircumcised Gentiles coming into the synagogue, and that's what started the whole thing. I don't think it was about salvation. And that would also explain why the Acts 15 decision is a good segue. If you look at what the decision is, James says that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God. So these are not full converts. These are guys that are brand new. They are turning. They're in the process of converting or whatever. But that we should write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from what has been strangled, and from blood. So these are 4 essentially like purity commands. And that's enough to get them in the door. And that's what I think the point is, because verse 21, from ancient generations, Moses has been read in the synagogue every Sabbath. So that's kind of what I think the issue is what do we have to do to get these guys in the door without causing too much chaos?
Yeah, definitely. The big problem with Acts 15, if you're arguing for Acts' historicity, is that I think Acts probably doesn't know Paul's letters personally because it's clearly an apology for Paul. There's no question about that. Unanimous position in scholarship. And so why would Acts paint all these things that make Paul look like a liar? For example, James commissioning Paul, saying, hey, we don't have to teach circumcision, but here's 4 things you absolutely must tell all of your Gentile converts that they must obey. Fornication, and then 3 items about basically eating meat sacrificed to idols and all that. And he forbids Paul from teaching these things, right, in Acts 15. And then, of course, in Paul's letters, he's totally signing off on eating meat sacrificed to idols. It's fine if you do it, fine if you don't do it, who cares? Totally disobeying James's commission to him. And so you're like, why would Luke make Paul look like a liar in this regard? It seems like more likely that he doesn't even know Paul said that, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think so. Yeah, that's like one of those things I think is historically accurate, that this is a decision made by James,
Right.
but maybe the author of Acts wasn't aware of that, because it's like that's the very next slide is how Paul then goes in and he's completely defiant of what is said, what was decided.
Yep.
So 1 Corinthians 8, starting at verse 4, therefore, as to the eating of food sacrificed to idols, so this is one of the 4 purity commands, we know that an idol has no real existence and that there is no God but one. Okay, so basically he's saying, I think, that an idol has no power. And then he says, not all possess this knowledge or gnosis, but some. So who is this? Now, when somebody says, some think this or some think that at times it would be something you would use for someone in authority that you're not really comfortable with openly criticizing. So like if you're mad at your boss and you're like, well, some people say we can't have a 15-minute break or whatever,
It's true. Yeah.
So he says, but some, through former association with idols, eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. So who are these with the weak conscience? Well, I think he's pointing the finger at James and the apostles. They're the ones that are saying don't eat meat sacrificed to idols.
Yep.
He says food will not commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, or no better off if we do. So Paul, as far as Paul's concerned, go ahead and eat. So obviously Paul has no issue about whether you eat or not. As far as he's concerned, the idol affects not the sacrifice at all. Which, if you look at what Peter says in the Clementine Recognitions, he says that if you're eating meat that's sacrificed to an idol, that opens you up for demonic possession, because the idol, if it has like a demonic entity attached to it, then you can have it transferred through the meat, because you're essentially having a covenant meal with this entity. But Paul doesn't seem to agree with that. He says, take care that this right of yours, so he's saying you have a right to eat off of this sacrificial offering, does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. Again, the weak that he's referring to are the actual church leadership. Because if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, this is probably the most outrageous thing that Paul says, that he is actually saying it's okay for you. You have a right to go into the temple of some foreign god and eat the meat in the temple itself. You're not even buying it in the meat market. You're going into the temple and eating it. Will he not be encouraged if his conscience is weak to eat food sacrificed to idols? And so by your knowledge, this weak person has destroyed the brother for whom Christ died. So I think it's pretty clear what Paul's stance is. He's essentially given a green light to any of his followers to eat meat sacrificed to an idol, even as far as going into the temple itself and eating it.
Wow.
And just we don't do it in front of those weak Jerusalem apostles, right?
Right. Yeah. Don't let them see you doing it.
The weak siblings of Jesus. We have so much contextual evidence that James's ruling at the Jerusalem Council was truly a debate that was raging in early Christianity. I mean, this was, according to the historical sources, the Essenes were debating this issue with the other Jewish sects. We know the demonology and how demons could be attached to meat sacrificed to idols. This is discussed extensively in the Clementine literature. We literally have so much contextual evidence that this debate between James and Paul about meat sacrificed to idols was one of the main topics of debate in the early church.
Oh yeah, no question about that in scholarship. And there's also no question that a lot of these passages, like we just read, when Paul's talking about those who are weak, those who eat vegetables, scholars say, oh yeah, he's talking about Jewish Christians for sure. But it's like, but the implications of that are huge because these Jewish Christians are the original followers of Jesus and James the Just, his brother. So it's like,
Right.
by virtue of mocking the Jewish Christians, he is making the same slights against James and the 12 that are leading these people. And another interesting thing about Acts 15 is that it actually proves that Luke, or whoever the author of Acts was, is making up a narrative, again, to smooth over Paul's reputation, because in Acts 15, James is quoted as misquoting a passage from Amos chapter 9. In the chapter of Acts 15, James quotes it from the Greek Septuagint, which right away gives away that this is not historically accurate, because James would never quote a Greek Septuagint passage in a synagogue or in a Jewish meeting of any kind. You would quote the Hebrew Bible. And there's a famous mistranslation in the Greek Septuagint of the chapter in Amos 9 he's quoting, and James actually quotes the mistranslation from the Greek Septuagint in this chapter. And so scholars look at that and say, well, this is obviously an entirely made up narrative here. But that doesn't mean that this meeting didn't take place, as David said. There clearly was a meeting or a council here with Paul and James and the apostles over circumcision and what the Gentiles should or shouldn't do. But the thing is, the author of Acts is clearly changing what was likely said in that meeting or council to make Paul out look like he wasn't the bad guy in that exchange, or he wasn't being condemned for something. So clearly, the historical Paul did have some big issues with the Jerusalem apostles that needed to be smoothed over by the later author of Acts. And that's kind of the point that scholars pull out here.
Yeah, so I mean, we do that today in historical fiction. Like we might have a like a historical record of a meeting between George Washington and John Adams
Right.
and Ben Franklin, and we know what they decided in the meeting. But then an author might make up like a scene in a play where this meeting plays out, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everything in the play is historically accurate as to what happened in the meeting. And it's kind of the same thing here. Like, the author of Acts may have known what was decided, may have known who was at the meeting, and then he just kind of filled in the details and used the Greek Septuagint and came up with a mistranslation.
Yeah. The biggest criteria is the criterion of embarrassment for these kind of things. That if Paul wasn't being accosted by James for teaching the wrong things to Gentiles, the author of Acts would never even make up a situation where that happened. He would only do that if this was a known historical event that took place and Paul has a bad reputation for it. So let's rewrite what really happened to smooth over Paul's experience with James. It's the same thing that happens in many other cases we see in the New Testament. So the criterion of embarrassment is a big one for uncovering what actually happened. It's like if it's an embarrassing thing for Christianity or the Christian tradition, then it's likely referring to a real historical event. And case in point for that would be 2 Timothy 1:15, where Paul says, all those in Asia have turned away from me. It's like, well, if that didn't happen, or if that wasn't something Paul had actually said, then the forger of 2 Timothy wouldn't have put those words in Paul's mouth. So these are some other examples of this criterion.
Right.
Hey, if you enjoy these teachings and you want to dive deeper into this work with me, then you can join 4D University today for a low monthly membership to get access to all 8 of my Foundations courses that teach you how to master practices like spiritual balancing, heart-based consciousness, Kundalini awakening, and many others. You'll also get access to all my Jesus Way content like the Gospel Conspiracy, the Jesus Way Philosophy series, all past workshops, and live weekly calls, where you can listen to my weekly lessons and ask your questions and join a community of over 20,000 spiritual seekers just like yourself. You can click the link in the description below to learn more and register today. And now, back to the video.
Yeah, and I think it also shows the power of just propaganda, because even though they put these embarrassing things in, people still take Paul seriously. Like you slow down and look at some of the things he says and compare, like we're doing here, comparing 1 Corinthians with the book of Acts, and you see all these inconsistencies, and like I'm surprised people don't see it. More people don't see it. And
Oh,
you
yeah.
start slowing down and looking at this, and you're called a heretic or whatever. But they say they're Bible believers, but they don't want to believe the things they don't want to believe. So
Well, now this information is getting out and it's starting to explode. You know,
yeah, it
with
really is.
Oh, yeah.
Professor Jang building a huge following and talking about this, I think this message is going to start hitting critical mass because, like you said, David, there's just so many inconsistencies and so much tomfoolery when you
Red
look at
flags
some of the
galore.
yeah.
So we're going to skip over to 1 Corinthians 10 real quick. It says, if one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you're disposed to go, eat whatever set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. Now, I've actually had someone say that, well, I mean, Paul's saying, that you shouldn't do it for the sake of your conscience. But then the very next verse, he says, I don't mean your conscience, but his, the other person. So
Yeah.
the very next verse, he contradicts what this person was trying to twist his words to fit. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced? Because of that for which I give thanks. So there's a lot that's being said here. First,
Wow.
Paul's being denounced. Somebody is denouncing him. He is claiming that he has liberty to do this, and he's calling it his right, his freedom to eat whatever's put before him. So this really just comparing this to the decision in Acts 15, it tells you that Paul is absolutely bucking the system in complete defiance of everything that James said.
Yeah, same arguments that carnivores use for justifying involved in animal genocide. They'll be like, well, why should my freedom to eat what I want, be hampered by someone else, a vegan's conscience, or even the animal's conscience? Oh, the animal doesn't want to die? Well, why should that interrupt my freedom to eat animals? It's like, this is Pauline logic, man, at its best.
Well, hasn't I read an article a while back that said that they've actually found human DNA in McDonald's hamburgers.
Oh, yeah, that's a
And
big
so
thing.
some people objected to that, but come on, man, just eat whatever's set before you. Don't raise any conscience. Yeah, I mean, what does it matter if it's a human cadaver that you're eating? Are you a legalist?
And the psychological torment on people who slaughter the animals too. Who cares? Who cares if all these humans are, have terrible PTSD and are resorting to drug addiction and alcoholism and domestic abuse as a result of killing mammals all day? Don't be a legalist.
Yeah, if somebody sets before you a human hamburger, you're no better off if you eat it and no worse off if you don't, according to Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, why would you not just believe Paul? I mean, clearly he has a very logical, cognizant argument.
He has the right hand of fellowship.
So, in the process of looking at these, we and just kind of making the point that he's obviously in defiance of James. In chapter 9, he actually explains a little bit about what was going on there. And what it basically boils down to is he misrepresented himself to the leadership of the church, and he admits it in his signature prideful way. He says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Haven't I seen Yeshua the Messiah, our Lord? Aren't you my work in the Lord? If to others I'm not an apostle. See, there's an admission. Not everybody's agreeing that Paul's an actual apostle. Yep. Yet, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my office of apostle in the Lord. For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all so that I might win more. To the Judeans, I became as a Judean, so that I might win the Judeans. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though myself not being under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without law. To the weak, we know who the weak is, I became weak. So to the weak, I pretended to be one of them, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save them. So,
Man.
this is where I come from. We call this lying. Like,
yeah, this is called deceit.
Yeah.
Demagogue.
Right. So he's pretending. He's presenting himself as something different. So again, like, back to my example of that pastor shaking my hand. Well, what if I've been going to his church for a while and I misrepresented myself as a good old Pauline Christian who believed in faith, not works, and all this other garbage. And then he sent me on a mission trip. And when I got on this mission trip, I was telling everybody that you're saved by works, like any good servant of Satan would do, teach people to obey Jesus. I mean, like, I would be called a heretic. I would be maligned for that. But for some reason, when Paul did the same thing, it's a virtue.
Yeah. And then even the part you highlighted, sorry to interrupt, to the weak, I became weak. Maybe you were going to make this connection already, David, but just to show what a slam dunk this is, that he's talking about the Jerusalem apostles. We have early attestations we've shown on this podcast many times that says James the just was without flesh consumption from birth, never ate flesh. Mm-hmm. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians, the weak eat only vegetables. And we also know through, again, enormous widespread attestation that the Nazarenes and Ebionites, the Jewish Christian sects that claimed we are the descendants of James and the brothers of Jesus, the whole Jesus dynasty, we are their followers, we are their descendants, they were all vegetarian. And so Paul is mocking the Jewish Christians for being vegetarians, and he calls them weak. So to the weak, I became weak. So when he's around vegetarians, he pretends to be a vegetarian, is what he's basically saying there.
Yep. Yeah, that's precisely what he's saying. When he's around them, he pretends to be completely on board with their doctrine. But then when he gets away from them, then suddenly he has this freedom to eat things sacrificed to idols and all these other things.
And those so-called pillars.
And, guys, we just have to say it. Saul was persecuting the early followers of Jesus. He was potentially killing them. Prosecuting,
persecuting them to the death.
So if he is still continuing to lie like this, that means he's still caught up in this sin, that he hasn't fully repented. And if I don't know about you guys, but if I met someone who was a former murderer, I would be like really watching out on their behavior to see if they were slipping in any way, So it's important to keep the context that this guy was persecuting Christians in mind as we read about him boasting and lying and these different things, because we have to see the full picture of everything together.
Yeah, there's a certain element to it where he obviously thinks he's better than everyone else in this movement. The pride, that's where the pride really comes through. He thinks he's better than the apostles. He thinks he's better than James. He probably thinks he's better than Christ. And you see all that coming through in his writings.
He literally says, I'm a greater servant of Christ than them because I've suffered more than them.
Yeah, so he gets down in this quote from Romans 7, that if through my lie the truth of God abounded to his glory, why am I also still being judged as a sinner? Like, he doesn't even understand why it's wrong to lie. He got his way into the Jesus movement by misrepresenting himself. He admits that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And even as late as Romans, he still doesn't understand what he did wrong.
Yeah, this is some really poor logic on Paul's part here. If by my lie the truth of God abounds, what? Last time I checked, truth cannot abound through lies, because lies are the opposite of truth. And this goes back to what James just said of why it's important to remain with healthy skepticism about people that have very dark pasts, because, and this is something I don't think Christianity understands at all,
when it comes to like spiritual growth and how the progression of consciousness goes, you don't just wake up a completely healed whole person from saint to sinner because I saw Jesus in a private vision in the desert. Poof, now all my sinful tendencies and selfish habits and pride, it's all gone and I'm a saint from heaven. There is no universe in where that takes place. People have encounters with Jesus all the time and they retain all the same problems they had before. And you have to, through spiritual discipline and living the teachings of Jesus, transcend those bad habits within yourself, those sinful tendencies. That's free will. God's not going to just take away your sinful tendencies because you had a private vision. And so forgive us for being skeptical that a serial killer of Christians may still retain some sinful tendencies, right? And clearly in Paul's letters, we see all those sinful tendencies on rampant display, narcissism being number one, in my opinion. And right here, justifying lying to the apostles and the leaders of the Jesus movement themselves. I mean, these are major red flags that if you care at all about what is true and following Jesus, you cannot ignore these things.
If you read Romans 7:7, does that sound more like Jesus or like a Pharisee?
That's an excellent
Jesus
point.
saying that.
Yeah.
Imagine Jesus saying that. That sounds like a line straight out of the Pharisees.
Remember when Pilate asked Jesus, what is truth? Imagine Jesus looking at Pilate, out of the side of his eye, and he's like, if by my lie, the truth of God abounds. What is it to you, Pilate?
All right. So, at this point, let's move ahead to 2 Corinthians. This would be at some point.
Stuff is.
What?
I said this is where the juicy stuff is.
Oh yeah, yeah. So this is somewhere at some point after the meeting in Acts 15, whether it's later on, even years later, or just within a shorter period of time. Notice that in 1 Corinthians, Paul was talking about how it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols. And Peter, according to Peter's teachings, that opens you up to demonic possession. Well, notice, cause and effect here with 2 Corinthians 12:7. So, to keep me from being too conceited by the surpassing greatness of the revelations, very humble guy there, a stinger was given to me. Yeah. A stinger was given to me in the flesh, an angel of Satan to harass me. So, of course, most translations clean it up where it's a messenger of Satan, but the word there in Greek is angelos satana, angel of Satan. And this thing is in his flesh. That, to me, sounds like demonic possession, to harass him, to keep me, Paul, from being too conceited. 3 times I begged the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so the power of Christ may rest upon me. So Paul's position is, in order to keep me humble, I got this, satanic angel in my flesh, and now I'm going to boast all the more.
Yeah, this is such a fascinating passage for so many reasons. First of all, Paul is saying in the opening verse that it's Jesus who gave him the angel of Satan, right? Mm-hmm. To keep me from becoming conceited. Okay, that's obviously God's will, right? An angel of Satan was given to me. So we pulled this out in our last episode with you, David. The Jesus of the Gospels, the historical Jesus, never was seen giving anybody a demon, but was actually seen casting out demons left and right, and said himself, Satan cannot drive out Satan. So then when Paul says here, I pleaded with him to remove this demon from me. Please, Jesus, cast this daggone demon out of me like you did with everybody else when you were alive. And Jesus says, sorry, Paul, my grace is enough for you. And Paul's like, okay, great. That's to just let me boast even more of my greatness because now I'm so humble because I have a demon. None of this is adding up, in my opinion. And I think the smoking gun for me in this passage is that Paul is, like in the book of Acts, we have this scholar here from this book. I took on a class on Paul, Calvin Rotzel. He's talking about a lot of these same issues that Paul is having with the Jerusalem apostles. And these passages in 2 Corinthians, apologists are notorious for saying, oh, Paul's not talking about the Jerusalem apostles. He's talking about some other people unrelated. But this is actually after Paul sends his gift offering, his famous collection to the saints. And neither Paul nor the book of Acts comments that it was accepted, which according to this scholar, Dr. Rotzel, is pretty clear evidence that it was rejected. And if Paul's gift was rejected, that would be tantamount to exile, meaning you're not allowed, you're not part of our group, man. You're not allowed here. Why would you refuse someone's goodwill offering unless they were essentially someone you saw as so untrustworthy or of such bad reputation that you didn't want to be associated with them? And so Paul is kind of trying to save face here in this part of 2 Corinthians. He's going on all these different angry tirades, complaining about the disciples, as we'll see here in a second, and then even boasting about, oh, God, Jesus gave me a demon to keep me from becoming conceited. And it's like, again, where do we have any evidence that the historical Jesus would do something like that? But if Paul's private Jesus isn't casting out Satan from him, well, that falls right in line with what Jesus said, that Satan can't drive out Satan. So that's kind of the smoking gun that Paul was clearly being deceived by a demonic entity.
Yeah, and it put it in context of some of Paul's other sayings, like if even an angel from heaven preaches a different gospel than me, let him be accursed. Now, is he saying that? Or is the angel of Satan in his flesh saying that to curse an angel from heaven that has different beliefs or different theology than him? I don't know, but these are important questions to ponder.
Yeah. And like what you were speaking about with that offering, if we were to take Paul and put him into modern terminology, he was essentially like deep state. He was a member of the Herodian family. He was an agent of the high priest. He was sent to murder the opposition, which was the Christians. And what is it that the deep state will always do to kind of get their way into some group that they want to subvert? Well, they usually, it's a big offering of money. So this whole offering that Paul gives, I almost see it as like this, deep state attempt to come in and take over the movement. And by rejecting it, James was essentially preventing that from happening.
Yep.
So yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure in the Gospels, Jesus said that he was giving his apostles authority over demons. So why is Paul not able to cast this demon out? Because when the disciples returned from their first missionary trip going around Israel, they say that, they were amazed because the demons obeyed them. But Paul's not having that kind of authority, as far as I can tell from what he's saying here in 2 Corinthians 12.
Right. Well, in the book of Acts, Paul actually strikes somebody blind as a kind of punishment miracle, doesn't he?
Well, his Jesus strikes him blind.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So we've got some bad fruit coming from this tree.
Yeah, I mean, the Jesus of the Gospels gave sight to the blind, not blindness to the sighted. So,
that's called an inversion.
Yeah, seems a little inverted to me. So Paul's talking about this grace that's sufficient, and James turns around and says, yeah, but he gives more grace because it says God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. I wonder who needs to humble themselves. Maybe it's this person that's so conceited he needs a demon to humble them. He says, be subject therefore to God, but resist the devil and he will flee from you. Draw to God and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. So I really feel like this is a response to Paul's situation. He goes, just do what's right and the devil will flee from you.
James was so tapped into the nature of demonic infiltration and possession, because from our study of demonology and my own personal experience, for instance, I used to have a drug problem, and it was just a voice absolutely compelling me to use drugs. But when you resist that voice for long enough, it completely evaporates, and it's no longer a problem at all. But while you're still engaging in the sin, the devil has extreme power over you. So that leads me to believe that Saul was engaged in at least one, but probably a variety of severe sins, which gave the angel of Satan power over him.
Well, if you listen to
100%.
any deliverance minister, they talk a lot about agreements and how do people get demonic entities. Well, they agree with this entity. So you enter into an agreement with it, like a demonic presence or whatever. Then it's essentially opening you up to their authority.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. I mean, sin is just a privation of good. And so when we sin, this is the reason that Jesus taught against sin. Jesus said, if anyone who continues in sin is the slave of sin. So be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Like the works-based soteriology is clear in Jesus's gospel, because sin is what gives openings to the demonic realm. Because when you're acting on a privation of good, that's basically an open doorway for the demonic. And one of the 7 deadly sins is pride. And I'm sure you're going to get into here in a second, David, James saying that boasting is evil.
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to get into that?
Yeah, it's in there.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'll save it for that section.
And
there.
then real quick on the last slide, we know Paul was engaged in lying, which is a severe sin.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the openings for the demonic are all over the place, just from his own admissions.
Yeah,
Well,
that list, the list that Jesus gives, where he says the things that will corrupt you are these. I refer back to that list a lot, and a lot of it deals with things that we see Paul doing, but one of them is false testimony. And so, it's not just that you are lying, it's that this is something that will corrupt you as a person.
Yeah. I'm not totally sure if this is accurate, but I'm pretty sure that, was it Proverbs 6 or 16 that talks about the 7 deadly sins?
The lying
Pretty
tongue.
sure that it goes in order of haughty eyes, which is pride, a lying tongue, and then hands that shed innocent blood. It's like Paul has check, check, check on the first 3 7 deadly sins.
Wow.
So at this point, let's just, I'm essentially turning to Galatians, and we're just going to kind of work our way through it and compare what Galatians says to what James responds to. I was actually watching a video about a Christian recently, and he was responding to some of these allegations that Paul taught something different than the apostles. And what did he use as proof that Paul taught the same gospel as the apostles? Galatians chapter 1.
Wow.
I couldn't believe it, because he went to Galatians chapter 1. He's reading one verse, and like the very next verse, he's bragging about how he didn't get his instruction from the apostles. And I just thought it was so ironic that if he just read all the verses on his screen, he would realize how off base he was. But Galatians starts off, Paul, an apostle, not sent from men, nor through the agency of man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. So right away, he's telling you he doesn't have authority from any of the apostles, because it was not from men. He wasn't sent from men or the agency of men. Verse 7, there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. So, spoiler alert, Paul's the one who's actually distorting the gospel of Christ. Paul's the one with the false gospel. The ones that he says is distorting the gospel are the actual apostles. He says, for am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ, for I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man, for neither did I receive it from man, aka the apostles, did not receive it from a man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. So Paul himself is boasting about the fact that he did not have any type of instruction from the 12 apostles, which I think should be a cause of concern.
and he received it through a revelation that was so surpassingly great that it had to come with a demon attached to keep him from being too conceited about the greatness of that revelation. I mean, that checks out.
Yeah. Well, he uses that language of some again. There are some that are disturbing you. And again, like I said earlier, that's usually the some is somebody you don't want to name because they actually have authority over you. And so, just take a moment to appreciate the arrogance of what Paul says at the beginning of Galatians. It's actually kind of mind-boggling.
It is, man. And isn't it Galatians 1 or is it 2 where I think it's 2, those so-called pillars, whatever they were, makes no difference to me. Like, no respect for the people who actually walked and talked with Jesus and learned from him, nor his blood brothers who were born and raised with him. Whatever they were when Jesus was around, it means nothing to me, those so-called pillars. If Paul is so cavalier in talking about the disciples by name, he says James, Peter, and John, those so-called pillars, then why would we not assume that all these other insults he's couching under, some people, blah, blah, blah. Why would we not assume those are also being directed at the Jerusalem leadership?
Yeah. Yeah, you look at what he says about the weak, and that obviously correlates with James and his decisions about not eating meat sacrificed to idols, and then the issue you just brought up. I mean, it should just be like a logical understanding that the other people that he's condemning are the same group that he condemns by name. So Galatians 1:3, grace to you and peace from God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, who gave himself for our sins so that he might rescue us from this present evil age according to the will of our God and Father, to whom be the glory forevermore. So he's blessing God. And then he gets down. Yeah, but then he gets down to verse 8 and he says, but even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we have said before, I say to you again now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed. So he's blessing God, blessing God, but cursing men. And then James is like, but no one can tame the tongue. It's a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men. I wonder who he could be referring to doing that. Who have been made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessings and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be this way.
Yeah, Jesus taught us to bless even our enemies.
Right.
And here Paul is teaching us to curse angels from heaven who are direct emissaries from the Father. So angels don't even have free will. They're literally, angels from heaven are direct ambassadors of the Father.
Messengers of God. That's what their name means. And I mean, even then, Jesus also said, do not curse your brother. Anyone who says to his brother, you fool, will be in danger of the fires of Gehenna. And of course, in Galatians 2, when he's rebuking the Galatians for believing those weak Jewish Christians down in Jerusalem, he literally says, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It's like, I know you never met Jesus, bro, but he literally told people not to call people fools.
Yeah.
So it's like the evidence is just mounting here. Curse them, you fools. Where did Jesus curse people or teach us to curse people? Where did Jesus say we can call people fools? I mean, all of these things are direct contradictions to the teachings of Yeshua.
Correct. Here he goes on with his humble speech. But when God, who had set me apart even from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me, so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away to Arabia, returned once more to Damascus. Then 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas, and stayed with him 15 days, but I did not see any of the other apostles except for James, the Lord's brother. So he's very specifically and repeatedly emphasizing the fact that he was not taught his doctrines by the apostles.
Yeah. What's also interesting about this is how he says after 3 years of his desert delusions, he goes up to the Jerusalem apostles to consult with them, which anyone who's trying to be a new apostle of Jesus would have to do, right? At some point, And he had probably been, I would imagine Paul had been building this moment up in his head of like, oh man, I can't wait to meet them. They're going to see the grace of God on me and approve of me, and I'm going to be the new apostle to the nations. And he goes, he says he consults with Cephas and then meets James. And then in the very next chapter, as we're going to see, there's this huge argument where he gets all angry at Peter and publicly calls him a hypocrite and stuff. They're like, whoa, man, you got some bad blood with Cephas, bro?
Yeah.
And then you read the Nazarene tradition and the Nazarene Acts, the Clementine writings, and it's this entire book basically about Peter following around Paul and debating him and rebuking him. And so you're like, what happened in that first meeting where Paul went up to be acquainted with Cephas? He was probably thinking, oh, they're going to totally see that I'm anointed. And Peter was probably like, yo, we got some kooky dude here that thinks he's hearing from Jesus in private visions, James. What are we going to do? You know?
Well, there's one point where James calls Paul an empty man. You know, Paul's claiming to have James's brother living within him, and James is like, you're an empty man, dude.
Ouch.
Verse 20 is pretty interesting to me. Now in what I'm writing to you, before God, I'm not lying. It's an odd thing to say when you're telling the truth. Then I went up into the regions of Syria and Cilicia. I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea, which were in Christ, but only they kept hearing, he who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith which he once tried to destroy, and they were glorifying God because of me. James, of course, is like, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath. You know, Paul's over here swearing to God that he's not lying, and I believe that Jesus spoke against that.
He did.
I guess Paul didn't get the memo. All right, so here we get up to Galatians 2. This is the real juicy stuff. It says, then after an interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also. It was because of a revelation that I went up, and I submitted to them the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles. But I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear that I might be running or had run in vain. Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised, but it was because of false brethren sneakily brought in, who has sneaked in to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to bring us into bondage. But we did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour, so the truth of the gospel would remain with you. But from those who were esteemed to be something, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality, while those who were esteemed contributed nothing to me.
Wow. That's
Crazy.
He's a real sweetheart. So later, when we get to verse 9, it's going to identify who those were esteemed to be something people were. And then verse 12, I think, is going to indicate who the false brethren were. But so Paul's pretty much, he's being pretty candid here and setting the stage for his open contempt that he has for the church leaders.
I mean, yeah, another smoking gun right there is men were sent to spy out our liberty. I think in this actual book that I mentioned earlier, he shows that that's obviously talking about how the Jerusalem church was hearing from far away, hey, there's this guy up here teaching the Galatians all these things about Jesus and faith alone, and saying he's experiencing Jesus in private visions and he's an apostle. Like, is this guy rocking with y'all? And they're like, what? And they're like, we got to go send somebody up there. And so they send some spies to go up to Paul's church in Galatia to hear what this guy's teaching about. I mean, that would be the only way. If you're going to try to criticize the Jerusalem church for doing that, it's like, that's the only way they could get an honest answer to the question of, what is this guy actually teaching people? Because if they just go ask Paul, he's going to become weak to the weak and a Jew to the Jew. You know, he's going to do his shape-shifting thing. Be like, oh, no, I don't teach anybody faith alone apart from work. You're talking about some other guy. And then, of course, as soon as they leave, he's like, eat that meat sacrificed to idols. Who cares? He's flagrantly going against everything James commissioned him not to say and teach. But if they ask Paul that, he's just going to shape-shift like usual. So the fact that they sent someone to spy him out is, first of all, obviously the Jerusalem church. There was no other faction of Christianity organized enough at this point in the 50s or whatever to have this kind of interaction with Paul to send spies and stuff. But then he even seals it after that by saying, those who were esteemed to be something, whatever they were, makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Obviously, that's the disciples he's talking about. So you put those two passages together, the context is very clear through just basic exegesis. He's complaining about the Jerusalem apostles sending spies to spy out his liberty, aka me teaching whatever I want without the authority backing of the Jerusalem 12.
Well, isn't that just the way that a narcissist would handle something like that? Like if they get caught doing something they shouldn't, like if you have like a cheating spouse and the other spouse finds out because he was like reading her text messages or something, then that cheater that got caught, the narcissist would just be like there was some type of moral objection they would raise about you looking in their text messages or whatever.
Right.
It's kind of the
You
same
hacked
thing.
my phone.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not that he was doing anything wrong. It was these false brethren. It's the fault of the spies that he was found. And they weren't even spies. Yeah. I wouldn't even necessarily say they were spies. They were probably just auditors or whatever, just some of the leadership. James is like, if anyone among you thinks he himself to be religious while he doesn't bridle his tongue, and let's be honest, Paul's not exactly bridling his tongue in this chapter.
Yeah, not exactly.
But deceives his heart, this man's religion is worthless. And I agree completely.
This man?
This man.
Interesting choice of words there.
I wonder which man.
Well, isn't there another scholarly argument, guys, that maybe you know this, David, better than I do? Like, I've heard scholars say this was the common way that rhetoric would happen in those days, where you wouldn't just call out your opponent by name unless there was some kind of very serious accusation or something you need to make. If you're having a philosophical disagreement, you would almost never name your opponent, but you talk about your opponent's philosophy and beliefs, because like you want to appear classy and like you're above that. So you don't just call, oh, James, this stupid philosophy. You sort of make light of James' philosophy without mentioning him, so that the readers can draw their own conclusions of, oh, well, who believes this stuff? Okay, I see it. Here's the two philosophies being battled. And Paul falls into that rhetorical style very perfectly in his text, in the way that he talks about, like you pointed out, some people say this, those who used to be something. You really won't name them, but he's giving you all the context to know, ding, 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 he's pointing right at who he's trying to accuse.
It's plausible deniability too. Oh, James,
Right.
I wasn't talking about James. What are you talking about? I didn't say his name. I mean,
there's plenty of so-called pillars.
Yeah. Well, I do think that in the early church, like you see, well, first of all, Jesus, he speaks against slandering anyone, slandering your brother. James speaks against it, and the Didache speaks against it. So sometimes Christians will say, like, well, if Paul was a false apostle, why didn't they just call him out? And it's like, well, they do call him out. They just don't name his name. Galatians 2:7, but on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised, for he who effectually worked for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised effectually worked for me also to the Gentiles. And recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James, Kepha, and John, okay, now he's named them, that's who those supposed pillars were, who were esteemed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. And they shook their hand, and so therefore they agreed with everything that Paul believed.
Yeah.
So that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. They only asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. And so, like I mentioned earlier, I think this whole, they only asked us to remember the poor is telling us that there was some discussion about the way Paul was handling offerings. And we'll get to that later in the presentation. But I think that was a major issue with Paul. He mentions it in several letters, and I think that the apostles were concerned that Paul was essentially profiting off of the congregations.
Definitely. Yeah, this is the passage that we've showed many times on this podcast that Jerome writes about in his commentary to the Galatians, and says that when Paul says, They asked me to remember the poor. The poor is kind of the designation of the Jerusalem church, the Ebionim, the poor ones. And that's where we get the English rendering of that is the Ebionites, which scholars, again, unanimously agree is kind of the first Jewish Christian tradition that followed James the Just in the Jerusalem church. So he's saying, they asked me to remember how their congregation operates, meaning you can't just go around and claim you're part of our group and not abide by the rules of our group. In this group, we share everything in common. So no one has any possessions of their own. So Paul, you can't just be going around asking for money from all these churches and living this like luxurious apostle celebrity life abroad, right? Borrowing from our fame to give yourself street cred and then not be sending us back offerings from what you get. So that's why Paul says, and they asked me only to remember the poor, which of course I wanted to do that.
Yeah. But of course, it's not true, because they did ask more than just to remember the poor. They asked you not to eat meat sacrificed to idols, and not to eat things strangled, and not to play around with blood, and what was the other one? Fornication. I mean, there was more than just that. And so I think that Paul is saying that because he's obfuscating the fact. Yeah, another lie. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. Who was he condemned by? Well, Paul. For prior to the coming of certain men from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles, but when they came, he began to withdraw and hold himself aloof, fearing the party of the circumcision. So the party of the circumcision, according to Eusebius, it was Eusebius, was the actual Jerusalem leadership. So are we to believe that Peter is afraid of James? I don't think so. I think that's,
give me a break, dude.
Fallacious. The rest of the Judeans joined him in hypocrisy. So the rest of the Jews turned against Paul too, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. Okay, so now Barnabas is against Paul. So everybody's against Paul. But Paul is painting this whole picture as if he was justified in this getting up in Peter's face. He says, but when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in the presence of them all, if you, being a Judean, live like the Gentiles and not like the Judeans, how is it that you compel the Gentiles to live like Judeans? How do you compel them to Judaize? So this is Paul's version of events, and as you can probably tell, I don't really take it all at face value. I think that you read between the lines a little bit, you'll see that Paul was actually the one that got rebuked. And I think that's probably the whole reason he's writing Galatians, is he's trying to do some type of damage control, because he's on the verge of losing his entire ministry.
Wow.
Yeah, this is a very problematic passage if you're trying to support Paul's apostleship, because again, we have no records of any of the other apostles rebuking each other publicly and things like that. It seems like something an outsider would do who has a chip on his shoulder for some reason.
Right.
I mean, you approach one of the three pillars of the Jesus movement, Peter, and you have the arrogance to call him a hypocrite because you saw him eating with Gentiles. And so you just assume that he's doing that for all these selfish, arrogant reasons. And maybe, possibly Peter was just trying to show brotherhood to the new Gentile converts. And when the men from James, the rest of the apostles, showed up, he's like, hey guys, nice meeting you. I'm going to go eat with my apostles and brothers. Have a great day. And he goes over and eats with James. And Paul's like seething on the other side of the auditorium or whatever. And he's like, oh, that hypocrite, he leaves the Gentiles to eat with the Jews. I'm going to go rebuke him. And then he gets rebuked. Even his own traveling companion, Barnabas, leaves. Imagine if your best friend even says like, bro, you're wrong, dude. And you still have the arrogance to be like, no, I'm right and everyone's wrong. James, the brother of Jesus, his appointed successor, he's wrong and a hypocrite. Peter, the pillar of the Jesus movement, he's wrong and a hypocrite. Barnabas, my traveling companion, he's wrong and a hypocrite. I'm right. This is overt narcissism. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about this.
And also, one of the main characteristics of like a psyop or a deep state infiltration, as David said, is sowing division. And it almost seems that that's what's happening here, playing people against each other making up stories to make people look bad. This is a tale as old as time. And we see it happening to this very day, where people will be inserted into groups to spread lies and cause division. And I'm not saying I know that's what was happening here, but it certainly is plausible.
It raises an eyebrow for sure.
Well, my theory is I think that those guys showed up from James with a copy of 1 Corinthians and showed Peter the passages where Paul admits that he was teaching his followers that it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols. And so Peter's been having table fellowship with these guys who may have actually been eating food sacrificed to an idol, right before they came in there. And so I think that might have been going on also. Just after reading the recognitions of Clement and seeing what Peter says about eating meat sacrificed to idols and the consequences of it, that seems very likely to me to be what's kind of going on behind the scenes that Paul's not telling us.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. The other big red flag too in this passage is that in Matthew 18:15, I believe, 15 through 17, Jesus gives the criteria for how we are to handle grievances with our brothers. And he says, if your brother sins against you, first go to him in private and address your grievance towards him. So if Paul was so upset and so offended that Peter was eating with Gentiles for whatever reason, the Jesus way to handle that is to take Peter aside rather than try to embarrass him in public when you haven't even heard his side of the story yet. Paul directly violates the commandment of Jesus on how to deal with grievances. And then he even says, even if then he still doesn't hear you, then go get another brother and go back to him. And then the three of you talk it out. He gives you steps and criteria for how to handle these things. Paul skips over all of it and says, I'm going to take matters into my own hands and call the pillar of the Jesus movement a hypocrite in public.
Exactly. James 4:11, we spoke about this earlier about not slandering your brother. James says, do not speak against one another, brethren. He who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks against the law and judges the law. See, Paul, when he confronted Peter, he wasn't just, confronting him based upon their personal relationship. The understanding of the law was involved too. And so I think this is directly applicable to Paul here.
And I think really quick, what he's saying there too is Jesus said that the law is summarized. The entire Torah is summarized in love God, love your neighbor as yourself. And so that's also part of what James is arguing here, right? Is like, when you judge your brother, you judge the law, because the law is love your neighbor as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So
but if you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge of it. There's only one lawgiver and judge, the one who's able to save and to destroy. But who are you who judge your neighbor?
Yeah, and calling someone a hypocrite is the definition of judging somebody.
Right. And the funny thing is, what is a hypocrite but somebody who pretends to be something they're not? And then it goes back to 1 Corinthians chapter 9.
Irony.
Yeah. He goes on to say, we are Judeans by nature, not sinners from among the Gentiles. Nevertheless, knowing that a man is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Christ Jesus. Even we have believed in Christ Jesus, so that we might be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law. Man, there is a not right there that Christians can understand. Since by works of the law, no flesh will be justified.
David, to play devil's advocate, how do we know Paul isn't just talking about, all the Levitical commandments? How do we know there's this distinction between maybe the 10 commandments and all of the commandments that Jews of today follow?
Well, I think for one, he would clarify in here that that's the way it is. But even, he says works of the law. I mean, even the 10 commandments is still part of the law. Yeah. So I don't think that's, I can see how somebody, I know that some Hebraic roots people will make the claim that he's actually talking about the oral Torah here and that sort of thing. And I just don't see it being in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I just asked because sometimes people try and rebut us by saying that like, oh, Paul was just talking about growing the sideburns and the tassels and things like that. What do you think, Aaron?
Yeah, my thoughts on this is that we know that Paul hung out with the Nazarenes for quite some time before he started his movement. He quotes, Nazarene hymns and things in some of his letters. He actually has a lot of Qumranisms, right? So he was even familiar with the Ebionim, the Qumran group, which is the Church of James probably in the first century. And that would lead me to believe that he understands their view of the law, which, again, widespread attestations from church fathers say that the Nazarenes reject certain sayings of Moses, claiming that they did not belong to Moses originally, and that basically they rejected all the liturgical commandments except for the 10 commandments, because, no duh, Moses just brought down 10 commandments from Mount Sinai. So where did we get these 613 laws? That was the opinion of the Nazarenes. So it's like, you can't convince me that Paul wouldn't have known the Nazarene view on what the law is. And especially, as Jesus and James both say, it's love God, love your neighbor. And so when Paul says the law, I don't know how you could argue he's not talking about or including in his mind what the Nazarenes think the law is.
Right. And the cherry on top is that you can cite the passage, but he refers to the 10 commandments as a ministry of death. Yeah. So if that doesn't show animosity for the true law, then I don't know what does.
Yeah, it was kind of like that passage that they just added to Mark chapter 7, where the and again, it's just been added. It's something the translator just made up, where he says, and thus he declared all food clean. Well, that doesn't even make sense, because in the mindset of a first century Jewish person, food is clean. So to say you declare all food clean doesn't actually do anything, because by definition, food is clean. So in order to say he declared all food clean, you would have to consider something like pork to be food, which it's not food. Moses, or well, not Moses, but the Leviticus is very clear about that. So it's kind of the same thing here. Like, if he's saying law, then if he's been around the Nazarenes, he knows what the law is, that the law is just the original law. So I think that he would have specified it, but he says he's pitting the law against faith. He says, not by works of the law, but through faith in Christ. So, he didn't say, but by faith in Christ plus keeping the 10 commandments, or plus keeping some of the law.
Right. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that.
There seems to be no question that Paul disagreed with the Jerusalem church's view of Jesus and his gospel and what matters. Like, he's constantly contradicting the way that James and the Jerusalem church saw things, the law, everything. To call the 10 commandments, which Jesus said is the only way to eternal life, is to keep the commandments. And he even lists 5 of them in Matthew. Don't steal, don't kill, don't lie. And then Paul calls the same 10 commandments a ministry of death etched into stone tablets. The fact that Jesus said, I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And Paul says, Jesus abolished the law in his flesh. Like, Paul had an axe to grind. There's no way of getting around it. He thought he was really receiving the true and correct revelation of Jesus in private. And all these kooky disciples just somehow missed it. And the smoking gun for this is Marcion. Marcion was the first real champion of Paul's letters. And he believed strongly that the disciples missed Jesus's message, but Paul got it. And many scholars think that the letters of Paul that Marcion was reading in the 2nd century would look wildly different than the ones we have today, because there was this 300-year battle between the Orthodox Roman Catholics and the Gnostics, primarily over the interpretation of Paul's teachings. So many Pauline scholars have argued convincingly that Paul's letters were probably much more Gnostic and much more overt about, I'm the one true revelator of Jesus, and those disciples, those so-called pillars, missed it. Because that's all the things Marcion believed about Paul and was the first champion of Paul. So this is kind of some pretty damning evidence if you're trying to support Paul being in alignment with the apostles of Jesus. We really don't find any evidence that he was, and we find nonstop evidence that he wasn't.
Yeah. And so especially when you compare him with James, like we're doing, because James quotes the same passages that Paul does,
Right.
uses the same scriptures, quotes them in the exact opposite manner. I mean, and once James starts going, it's not like he's just picking out random points that are all over Paul's letters. It's like a point from Paul, a point from James, and then the next thing Paul says, the next thing James says. It's like they just follow each other, and it's obviously James the one doing the response. He's taking Paul's letters and responding to them. James 2:14 is probably the most obvious response when he says, "What is it, my brethren? If someone says, someone, we know who that is, says he has faith but has no works, can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to him, go in peace, be warmed and filled, and yet you do not give him what is necessary for the body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. But someone may well say, you have faith and I have works. Well, show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works." And just a note, verse 15 and 16, this, to me, I think this might be another, James, again, alluding back to this accusation that Paul is misusing the funds that's being given. He's, instead of using that money to buy food for those in need, he's basically pocketing the money himself.
Wow. It makes me think of Jesus saying, those who love me keep my commandments. So like, it's impossible to actually have faith in Christ and not keep his commandments. Like, they're two sides of the same coin, and Paul separating them is a great injustice to Yeshua's gospel. And that's what James is getting at here. To follow Jesus is exemplified by the way you live. And it's so obvious. We all know this is true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And if Paul knows the Nazarene view of the law, the 10 commandments, the ones Jesus listed off, and he says, by works of the law, loving your neighbor, not stealing, not killing, no one will be justified before God. I mean, again, how do you defend Paul on this? No one will be justified by God for righteousness and service to others and loving God and loving your neighbor, but only by a belief in your brain. It's no wonder he said, I didn't get this from the apostles. He was just so high on his own horse that he really thought people would believe him. And as we know, in Paul's day, the overwhelming majority of churches he ministered to rejected him outright and even mocked him, such as he writes in 2 Corinthians and in 2 Timothy, right? He says, all the churches in Asia have rejected me. So Paul was almost totally rejected by everywhere he went to minister in his day. And again, it wasn't until Marcion, 50, 60 years later or whatever, that Paul's letters started to pick up steam when he was long gone. So like nobody would be more surprised than Paul himself if he were time traveled to today of what his teachings became, But I also think he probably wouldn't recognize a lot of his letters and be, whoa, like I didn't write this stuff, some of this stuff, or a lot of the stuff I did write's been taken out,
Yeah.
I just find it so fascinating and unbelievable of the bastardization of trying to earn your salvation. Yes, as a matter of fact, I would like to bask in eternal love and glory in the kingdom of heaven. Absolutely. And I would like to earn it too. And to say that in all of these churches across America where they profess their faith in Jesus, are they not trying to earn their salvation? Why exactly
What
are they
else are they doing?
professing? Exactly. So, and what leads to a better world? Faith with works or faith without works? Faith with
what
works,
brings the kingdom?
obviously, yes, that is what brings the kingdom. So it's I really feel like with this podcast, it's our responsibility to debunk this lie, which I think is actually a lie from hell. It emanates from hell that
Total
works don't
inversion.
matter. It's an evil inversion. We are supposed to do good works, and we're supposed to be passionate about it, and we're supposed to earn our salvation. Absolutely, we are.
Yeah, the gospel
Yeah.
was originally we need to be like Jesus. We need to do what Jesus did. And it's just because of Paul, it's turned into he already did it for us. And so it's like, how can you manifest the kingdom if you're not doing any type of the works that you would see in the kingdom? So, yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you're saying. The empty man. So I mentioned this earlier, Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And he says, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified? This is the only thing I want to find out from you. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing with faith? Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, you're now being perfected by the flesh? Now a mediator is not for one party only, whereas God is one. James says, you believe God is one, you do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But are you willing to recognize, you empty man, that faith without works is dead? So a very cogent put down of Paul there.
Shout out to James's shirt.
Yeah.
Hey guys, if you guys want to rock the Faith Without Works shirt, you can get that on shop.40university.com and all of our Jesus Way shirts as well. But first thing I want to say here really quick that I find interesting is, again, it's the you foolish Galatians direct contradiction with what Jesus said. But also in some translations, it says, you vain man.
Yeah.
And that vain man, I want to say that that's actually a Qumranism as well. That vain man shows up in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think Eisenman talks about this, Dr. Robert Eisenman, which is another interesting connection. But one of the ways that scholars know or identify which of the epistles Paul did write and which he didn't is because of things in form criticism that show authorship, like literary style, vocabulary choice, and so forth. Paul's letters are very easy to identify because he has, number one, a gigantic usage of first personal pronouns. I, me, my. He's just constantly using first person pronouns. Whereas you compare that to like the book of Hebrews, for example, and Paul uses more first personal pronouns in the first chapter of Romans than in the entire epistle to the Hebrews, which is how scholars know Paul's clearly not the author of Hebrews. He uses like 1,300% more personal pronouns than in any other of the 6 forged Pauline epistles. But another one of the giveaways is his usage of the word boast. And I actually have a graph on this. I think we showed it in our last podcast, but
Yeah.
he says the word boast about 64 times or something like that, maybe 56 times in his 7 letters, and like 3 times in the 6 non-Pauline letters, which is a dead giveaway. And we've read some of those passages already where he's like, I boast in myself and I boast in this and I boast in that. But if my boasting is boasting, then I boast not of my boasting. Boast. And James says in James 4:16, but as it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. So again, James directly saying all boasting is evil. There is no justification for boasting. And Paul's always trying to, if you notice in his letters, he's trying to come up with these convenient ways that he can humble brag about himself without looking like a narcissist. And he's like, guys, I'm just boasting in my weaknesses. Oh, I'm the least of the saints and apostles, which is like a low key way of saying I'm a saint, y'all. You know, we call these humble brags, right?
As a side note, just to kind of reinforce the connection between Galatians and the Epistle of James, there's only 2 places in all of the New Testament where the phrase God is one appears, and both of them are on the screen right now.
Wow.
So,
not even Deuteronomy 6?
Well, no, in the New Testament. But even
okay.
Deuteronomy 6 would say the Lord is one.
Yeah, true.
Instead of God is one.
Wow.
Paul goes on to say, even so, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Therefore, be sure that it is those who are of faith who are sons of Abraham. The scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the nations will be blessed in you. So then, those who are of faith are blessed in Abraham the believer. James responds with, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered his Isaac, his son on the altar, you see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God and was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see that a man is justified by works and not faith alone. So again, James is quoting the same scripture Paul uses to prove his worthless doctrine. James cites the same passage to refute it.
Yeah. Again, it's that common first century rhetoric way of debating opponents through these kinds of letters and so forth. You don't say who it is you're debating. You just make it as obvious as possible by quoting the same passages and, showing your line of reasoning against theirs. And James is doing this perfectly here in chapter 2.
Yeah. Galatians 5:1. It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery. You have been severed from Christ, you who are seeking to be justified by law. You have fallen from grace. James says, but one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of freedom, and abides by it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer, this man will be blessed in what he does. Paul calls the law a yoke of slavery. James responds, it's a law of freedom.
So, yeah, this is another big one. We read a passage from Romans 7 earlier, but if you guys want to see just how negative Paul's view of the law is, read Romans 7. I think it was almost a year ago now. James at my house one night doing a podcast prep, and we read through Romans 7, and I hadn't read through that chapter since I was probably, in church as a teenager or something. And our jaws were just like agape as we read this chapter about all the crazy things Paul says about the law. He says our sinful passions are aroused by the law. They're at work in our members to bear the fruit of death. But sin, seizing an opportunity through the law, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. So he's blaming his sin on the law and saying, if it wasn't for the law, I wouldn't even be a sinner. I wouldn't even know how to sin if the law had not taught me how to sin. So again, how can you justify those kinds of statements about the law when Jesus says the only way to eternal life is to keep the commandments of the law? When James, the brother of Jesus, says, he calls it the perfect law, which gives freedom.
There is no way to take both of these passages and correlate them to where they're saying anywhere near the same thing. It's the exact opposite. Galatians 5:13, for you were called to freedom, brethren. Only do not turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. James says, if, however, you are fulfilling the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Oh, look, he's quoting the exact same verse that Paul did again. What a coincidence.
Wow.
You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You are doing well. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles in one point, he has become guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not commit murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but do commit murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. Did Paul commit any murder? Probably not.
A couple.
So speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of freedom. So again, Paul is making the case that freedom is being without the law. James is making the case that the law itself is freedom.
Well, so we just talked about this a few slides ago, and I totally forgot about this verse in Galatians 5:13. We were making the argument that Paul would have obviously known the Nazarene view of the law, that it's really just love God, love neighbor, and all these man-made tertiary laws about purity crap. Like, this is man-made stuff. And Jesus heavily rebukes the Pharisees for this. You've made the word of God null and void, but through your traditions of man. You have a fine way of nullifying God's word with your man-made traditions. He's always castigating the Pharisees for being obsessed with these purity laws. So there's more proof of Jesus' view of the law. But right here we have Paul admitting that he knows the Nazarene view of the law that Jesus taught. The whole law is fulfilled in one statement: love your neighbor as yourself. So we can then obviously apply every other time Paul says the law, what is it? 1 Corinthians 15:56. The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. So the power of sin is love your neighbor as yourself. If Jesus just hadn't told me to love my neighbor as myself, I wouldn't be a sinner. This is crazy logic. It really is.
Well, again, it comes back to that narcissistic behavior where you blame everyone else and everything else for your problem. So it's not Paul's fault that he sinned; it's the law's fault.
Yep, the law made me do it.
2 Corinthians 3:1. Are we beginning to recommend ourselves again? Oh, this is so now we're jumping over to 2 Corinthians, and we're talking about these letters of recommendation. I alluded to this earlier when I was talking about being given the right hand of fellowship by that pastor the other day. So now I don't need letters of recommendation to be an official preacher in the Church of God. 2 Corinthians 3:1, are we beginning to recommend ourselves again, or do we need, as some, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You are our letter written on our hearts, known and read by all men, being manifested that you are a letter of Christ, cared for by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. Oh, how nice. How nice. Where's the letter at, Paul?
What an obfuscation.
Oh, man.
And
I don't need a letter of recommendation. It's just feel it in your heart.
You're my letter of recommendation.
Circular reasoning all day with Paul.
But I mean, this just common sense. Like in the example of that pastor, where I was like, if I went to some other church and I was like, hey, I was given the right hand of fellowship over here at this, Lawrenceburg Church of God, they'd be like, okay, well, do you have a letter from the pastor? Do you have some type of proof? And it's perfectly reasonable, I think, for a congregation to ask that question.
Yeah. Well, Aaron, imagine if someone was going online now and being like, I'm the right hand of Aaron, and I'm starts preaching all these messages that are very different from what you teach about. And people are like, wait, do you know Aaron? Do you have any evidence at all that you're connected with him? Just feel it in your heart, man.
I've been crucified with Aaron.
I filled up what was lacking in the suffering of Aaron. They'd be like, well, I mean, come on, bro. Just show us some proof that you know Aaron, like a text message conversation in your phone contacts. He's like, do I need a sum to show you my phone contacts that I know Aaron? You yourselves are my proof that I know Aaron because you approve of me. And I say I know Aaron. It's like circular reasoning. This is why in the first century and for many centuries, this was the common practice in the ancient world. If you sent an emissary or a apostle or a minister somewhere in your name, you always had to send a letter of recommendation, or else how can the church or the people that you're sending this person to be expected to trust this person's legitimacy? And we have widespread attestation of this in all other kinds of traditions around the first few centuries in the Mediterranean, that this was a common practice. There's no debate about this in scholarship. Even Paul talks about letters of recommendation he sends with, I think it was Phoebe or one of his female disciples. And, there's lots of evidence in the New Testament for this concept of letters of recommendation. So if Paul is complaining here, this is probably the most powerful argument that Paul was not approved of by the Jerusalem church, is that he didn't get letters of recommendation from them. And this, again, would have been standard practice. I think even in the Clementine writings, you see letters of recommendation at work as well from Jerusalem. And doesn't Peter say, David, that you should not believe anyone that doesn't come with the testimony of James?
Yes,
like a written.
It's actually on the screen.
Oh, well, look at that.
Yeah, Clementine recognition is 435. This is Peter speaking. It says, so observe the greatest caution that you believe no teacher unless he bring from Jerusalem the testimonial of James, Yeshua's brother, or of whosoever may come after him. For no one, unless he's gone up thither and there has been approved as a fit and faithful teacher for preaching the word of Mashiach, unless I say he brings a testimonial thence, is by any means to be received. So
Ouch.
no letter, no teaching.
It makes sense that they had to be extremely diligent about this because the early Christian movement had powerful enemies. There was the Jews, there was the Romans, there was a
Oh yeah.
variety of different enemies. And the easiest way to sabotage a movement is just to go around and do false flags or say things, claim to be a part of the movement and say or do bad things. So
Right.
it was just absolutely critical to the health of the movement that these letters of recommendation were taken seriously.
Yep. 2 Corinthians 5:12, we are not again recommending ourselves to you. See, they just keep, this is obviously a thorn in the side of Paul, no pun intended, this lack of these letters of recommendation. And then again, he says, you will have an answer for those who take pride in appearance. Well, who is the those? Who is the people issuing the letters of recommendation? Well, the only people who would have the authority to issue a letter of recommendation would be the church leadership. So 2 Corinthians 6:3, giving no cause for offense in anything so that the ministry will not be discredited. Oh, sounds like Paul's ministry might get discredited. But in everything, recommending ourselves as servants of God. Oh, so it's okay. Paul's recommending himself. Paul's both claimant and witness for himself. In much endurance, in afflictions, in hardships, in distresses, in beatings, imprisonments, in tumults, in labors, in sleeplessness, in hunger, in purity, in knowledge, in patience, in kindness, in the Holy Spirit, in genuine love, in the word of truth, in the power of God, in the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and the left, by glory and dishonor, by evil report and good report, regarded as deceivers. What? Somebody's regarding him as a deceiver. Somebody's giving him an evil report. And yet he's true. Nothing to see here, folks.
Wow.
Man.
Everybody agrees Paul is legit.
So we mentioned earlier about Paul's, he writes this in Romans, he writes it in Corinthians and Philippians to his congregants. Hey, please pray that the Jerusalem apostles will accept our offering, our gift. And this was part of what he said in Galatians, right? Remember the poor and give gifts to them. So Paul's like, okay, I got to do what they asked me to do. I'm going to compile this gift and I'll send it to them. And this was Paul's like hope and wish that his gift was going to be accepted so he could finally put this whole debate to rest. Is this guy a legitimate apostle or not? Everyone's accusing him of not being. And he's like, man, if they accept my gift, that'll be the final proof. But as scholars pull out, he's very nervous about this fact in his letters. And in fact, this scholar says, I'll read this sentence here. It says, with the letter to Rome dispatched, where he talks about, please pray that they'll accept my gift, and the journey to Jerusalem about to begin, Paul's voice fell silent. But the story was interrupted at an opportune moment when the hope for reconciliation burned brightly. Talking about reconciliation with the Jerusalem apostles. If we were forced to rely on the later Acts account to learn how the story ended, the outcome would be ugly, for scholars argue that Luke's aching silence about the offerings not being accepted suggests that they were rejected. And so in 2 Corinthians, Paul, as we saw, gets all angry and goes on these tirades about the apostles. And so there's a lot of evidence that his gift offering was rejected, not just from his letters, but the book of Acts as well. And in Romans 15:31, Paul admits that his fear that the Jerusalem saints would find his offering unacceptable. There's another dead ringer. And he says a few key things, like in this passage, David, where he says, oh, so what? Some say I'm a false apostle or whatever. He also says he was under scrutiny of guile and craftiness. So he's defending himself against accusations in 2 Corinthians 12 of guile and craftiness. And these are the chapters where he's condemning the Jerusalem church. And so this is another proof that these were criticisms levied against him by the Jerusalem church who did not accept his offering. And so Paul gets angry about it and writes all these chapters kind of venting his anger. And it's like, yeah, obviously it was rejected, because if it was accepted, it would be impossible to imagine that Paul would not admit, or Paul would not have written to one of his congregants, praise the Lord, the Jerusalem apostles have accepted my offering as a true apostle. And he would have bragged for days on end about this to his followers to gain that clout he wanted. So the fact that Paul never says that it was accepted, but gets really feisty when he talks about it. And then Acts also never says it was accepted, which again, Acts is an apology for Paul, defending Paul.
Yeah.
Acts would have also definitely not left that detail out, right, if it were true. So sometimes you learn more about what's historically true by what isn't said than you learn by what is said, right?
Yeah. And people, particularly in the Hebraic roots movement, they like to try and prove that Paul is legitimate by quoting positive things that Paul said about the law. Well, what you're talking about with him being nervous about going to Jerusalem, you see the most of that in the book of Romans. That's where that letter, he's really like,
oh yeah,
you can tell he's very nervous, and he's emphasizing that he needs them to approve what he's doing. And that's the only place you see him saying positive things about the law. And so when these Hebraic roots people or whoever that's trying to prove Paul was in favor of the law, they quote these verses. The verses are always from the book of Romans, because that's the only place he ever says anything positive about the law.
Yeah, because he's writing to a mixed audience of Jews and Gentiles.
Well, I think he's also considering the fact that Jerusalem might see the letter, and he wants to go ahead and sow that seed and make it seem like he's legitimate whenever he's really not. And that's the first thing they say to him in the book of Acts. When he gets there, they're like, so we've heard that you're teaching everyone to not keep the law. Like that.
The word is apostasy.
Yeah.
Jesus says every kingdom divided amongst itself will fall. But we see Paul's gospel divided and so confusing, right?
Yeah.
So it's almost like his teaching. I think it's in Corinthians, like God is not the author of confusion. Well, you are the author of confusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. So I mean, that's where all the confusion comes from. If it wasn't for Paul, we wouldn't have 40,000 Christian denominations. We might have 3 or 4, but that would be it. Yeah. It's all because they disagree over stuff that Paul says.
Yep. Every single time.
Yep. Okay, so here we're starting to get into the boasting. For even if I boast somewhat further about our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for destroying you, I will not be put to shame, for I do not wish to seem as if I would terrify you by my letters. For they say, who is the they? His letters are weighty and strong, but his personal presence is unimpressive and his speech contemptible. Let such a person consider this, that what we are in word by letters, when absent, such persons, we are also indeed when present.
Interesting.
James says, where do wars and fightings among you come from? Don't they come from your pleasures that war in your members? You lust and don't have. You kill, covet, and can't obtain. You fight and make war. You don't have because you don't ask. You ask and don't receive because when you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasures. I really wonder if he's talking about those letters of recommendation. You ask and you don't receive them because you ask for wrong motives. You have the wrong motivation for this ministry.
Wow.
Yeah, very well could be. In fact, there's a lot of interesting threads with the Corinthians. Cam points this out quite a bit. It's the quote from Ambrosiaster, I believe, that talks about the Corinthians, and it's a C-E-R, it's spelled in English, but it's like that. I mean, that has to be the same. Like you can't convince me there was 2 different communities called the Corinthians. One spelled with an E, one spelled with an O. It's like, it's probably just a different spelling of the same word and community. And he says the Corinthians rejected Paul because the other apostles said he was teaching something different than Jesus. And this was like a third or 4th century quote. And Dr. Rotzel argues in this book that who Paul is alluding to is Corinthians. Like even the church of Corinth he was writing to was divided on him. And he's always talking to his opponents at Corinth, like, hey, so some of you guys say that I'm unimpressive and small in stature. Well, my words are strong, right? And he's kind of defending himself against his critics in that church. And he's trying to sway the side of the church that is against him to side with him and join the others. So even in the church of Corinth, there's this huge divide. And Paul, most people don't realize this, Paul was like utterly rejected and mocked by them. One of the words that this scholar points out that they call Paul is womanish, that his appearance is womanish, I think, in this passage. And he gets, basically, they ostracize him. And so he gets with Titus, and he writes this long letter to the Corinthians, begging them to give him another shot. And come on, you guys understood me wrong. And he sends it off with Titus. And then Titus comes back and reports the good news that, hey, I read your letter to them. They're going to give you a second shot. And then Paul like celebrates in his writings, and he's so grateful that the Corinthians are giving him another chance again. So this community, there's so much evidence in Paul's writings. This community had big problems with Paul. And, probably the Jerusalem apostles sent some emissaries up there to check out what Paul's teaching. And they were dividing people against Paul, which is what he's complaining about here. But the historical argument is clear. There was no other organized faction of Christianity in the 50s AD other than the Jerusalem church, the Jewish Christians, the Nazarenes. So you're just going to have a hard time arguing that Paul's talking about anyone but the Jerusalem church, because it's like, okay, great. Show me one piece of evidence. Show me one piece of evidence of any other Christian group or faction in the time that Paul's writing these letters. I'll wait.
Yeah, it all has to do with authority. Like no other group would have, at that point, would have any kind of authority. Now, 100 years later,
Right.
you'd have Marcion and you'd have like different Gnostic sects. But in the first century, he didn't have that. The only people that he could be concerned about was the actual church leadership. So at this point, Paul goes into his several chapters, like 3 chapters of his like foolish boastings. So we'll go through what Paul says first, several slides of that, and then we get to what James's response is. And it's a pretty obvious response, the things that James says about boasting the way Paul is. He says in 2 Corinthians 10:12, for we are not bold to class ourselves or compare ourselves with some of those who commend themselves, which is kind of ironic because that's what he does. He says we're not going to compare ourselves to those, but then he does it throughout the next 3 chapters.
Yeah. And he commends himself all the time.
Yeah. But when they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are without understanding. For we will not boast beyond our measure, but within the measure of the sphere which God apportioned to us as a measure, to reach even as far as you. For we are not overextending ourselves as if we did not reach to you, for we were the first to come, even as far as you in the gospel of Christ, not boasting beyond our measure, that is, in other men's labors, but with the hope that as your faith grows, we will, within our sphere, enlarged even more by you, so as to preach the gospel even to the regions beyond you, and not to boast in what has been accomplished in the sphere of another. But he who boasts is to boast in the Lord, for it is not he who commends himself that is approved, but he whom the Lord commends.
So you can brag about yourself as long as you're attributing your good qualities to God. Oh, look at the surpassing great revelations that the Lord has given me. Oh, the Lord has anointed me. The Lord has made me. Jesus has made me a secret apostle. That's
Look
what
at
he's
these
saying.
biceps the Lord has bestowed upon
These
me.
biceps the Lord has granted me.
Look how awesome the Lord made me.
Look at these chiseled abs that the Lord created.
Look at this unibrow the Lord bestowed upon me. I wish that you would bear with me a little foolishness, but indeed you are bearing with me, for I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy, for I betrothed you to one husband, so that to Christ I might present you as a pure virgin. But I'm afraid that, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, your minds will be led astray by the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. For if one comes and preaches another Jesus, whom we have not preached, or you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, you bear this beautifully. I love the way Paul teaches that, or says that he's teaching a different Jesus, a different spirit, and a different gospel. It's a nice admission for him there.
Yeah.
For I consider myself not in the least inferior to the most eminent apostles. But even if I am unskilled in speech, yet I am not so in knowledge. In fact, in every way we have made this evident to you in all things. Very humble. Very humble.
Wow.
He's like Moses, the most humblest person ever to walk the face of the earth.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this
The
kind of,
distinction between James, just the energy and the vibe of James and Paul, I mean, it's like it couldn't be more different. It's a
yeah,
different religion.
Well, he mentions that different spirit, and it makes me think of Acts 16, where they have that woman with the spirit of Python that's
Yeah.
follows Paul around for like several days, saying these men are bond servants of the Most High God, and it's like he's getting his, this, I don't know what you call it,
Endorsement.
endorsement. He's getting this endorsement from a demonically possessed girl. And after many days, it says that Paul got annoyed with her and turned around and rebuked the spirit.
Yeah.
So he had, for several days, he had a demon-possessed girl coming around endorsing his gospel. Like,
Imagine if the chick from The Exorcist is all possessed and like endorsing you. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? You're doing great. Keep doing what you're doing. It's awesome.
her head spinning around the whole time.
it's like, hey, can you get lost? I'm trying to earn some good street cred out here.
Yeah. You're blowing up my spot here.
You're killing my vibe, dude. I mean, when have we seen Jesus be followed around by a demon, attesting to his ministry?
Yeah, demons ran for the hills. They would literally commit suicide or run off a cliff when Jesus was around.
And the crazy thing is, in the very next chapter, he's saying that he was given a demon to keep him humble. And he's sitting here like, I consider myself not the least inferior to the most eminent apostle. Even if I'm unskilled in speech, I'm not so in knowledge. like I'm the smartest guy alive.
Dude, he just never stops talking about himself, boasting about himself.
Pride is the greatest sin.
Himself.
Yeah.
Yeah. And comparing himself constantly to the disciples. And I'm sorry, you're just not going to convince me that the most eminent apostles, or other translations say the super apostles, that he could be referring to anyone but the 12. He right there, he says, I consider myself not the least inferior to the most eminent apostles. So he's admitting, I have a high view of myself. That's pride. That's narcissism. That is antithetical to the teachings of Jesus, period.
I mean, I think if I was the most eminent apostle, I could probably wrangle up a letter of recommendation.
At least have your gifts accepted. It's like, imagine if somebody sent you a gift in the mail and you like send it back and like stamp it rejected, like what would it take for you to reject a gift someone gave you? You would have to see them in a pretty poor light to be willing to not even accept the gift they're giving you.
Right. Wow.
Well, I mean, think about it from James's perspective too. Like, imagine if somebody came to you and was like, "Hey, Aaron, I'm going to give you $1 million," and you start thinking like, "Man, I can grow the ministry. We could like open up a local church and all these different ideas that start going through your mind of what you could do with that money to expand the message." And James is just like, "No, man, I'm good."
Yeah, it's tantamount to saying, I don't want anything to do with you.
Yeah. Well, I've heard many stories of people who have encountered demons or people possessed with demons, and they always try and give the person something and engage in a transaction. And when you accept the transaction, that gives the demon a foothold into the person.
Yep.
So perhaps that's part of what's going on here.
Yeah. Going on with chapter 11, or did I commit a sin in humbling myself? When did he humble himself? In humbling myself so that you might be exalted, because I preached the gospel of God to you without charge. I robbed other churches by taking wages from them to serve you. And when I was present with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For when the brethren came from Macedonia, then fully supplied my need, and in everything I kept myself from being a burden to you, and will continue to do so. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be stopped in the regions of Acacia. Why? Because I do not love you. God knows I do. But what I am doing, I will continue to do, so that I may cut off opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are, in the matter about which they are boasting. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. This sounds like there's projection going on there, that last verse. So yeah, I mean, this in itself, again, is indication that he's talking about the actual apostles. He says they're disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. I mean, who else could he be talking about besides himself?
Yeah. And he's admitting to robbery to start.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the theme that keeps coming up. And as I was putting the presentation together, I was just like, man, I mean, there's obviously something there. There's a lot of smoke there for there to be no fire, because it gets mentioned in 3 different letters. And whenever he mentions it here in 2 Corinthians, when we get to James's response, like it seems to get under James's collar a little bit, his response about the money issue. So I think I think there's something going on there.
Well, again, contextually, in these chapters, Paul has referenced and compared himself to the Jerusalem apostles many times now.
Mm-hmm.
And he hasn't shifted the context to anyone else to say, oh, and by the way, those other apostles over in this land over here that are not the Jerusalem apostles, they XYZ. He just keeps talking about these so-called apostles, these so-called pillars, and rebuking them and saying all these things about them. And so what context do we have that these deceitful workmen, false apostles, messengers of Satan, disguising themselves as apostles, what context do we have that he's talking about anyone else? We only have the context that he's comparing himself with the Jerusalem apostles. And furthermore, I'm pretty sure there's a good argument to be made that the word apostle at this point in time was not designated to anyone else but the 12, or maybe at most the 72, because those were the ones who walked and talked with Jesus. Jesus gave them this stipulation, right? If you want to be considered one of my 12 or my disciples, you must have witnessed my baptism by John and my resurrection. And Paul meets neither of those criteria. And so that's why Paul has to gin up all this false evidence that he is an apostle and go on in every letter just trying to convince everybody. Trust me, believe me, I really am an apostle. It's like, but if you were, you wouldn't have to say that. Do we have letters from Peter begging everyone to believe that he's an apostle? No, we just have that from Paul because he's trying to earn a reputation that didn't exist.
Yeah, we don't have letters from Peter talking about people disputing whether he's an apostle or not. No one disputes that. Yeah. But yet,
or Thomas or Matthew.
Yeah, but then Paul, for some reason, he's constantly saying that people are disputing him being an apostle. We got writings like the Acts of Thomas, or the Gospel of Philip, and all these others, and none of these apostles are debating that they are real apostles.
Because if you're a real apostle, you get letters of recommendation.
Yeah.
So you don't have to convince anybody. It's the whole purpose of it.
Exactly. Oh, here we go. No wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. I think James had mentioned this earlier. Therefore, it is not surprising if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. He's actually calling the apostles servants of Satan. That's just great. Whose end will be according to their deeds. Again, I say, let no one think me foolish, but if you do, receive me even as foolish, so that I also may boast a little. What am I saying? I am not saying as the Lord would, you got that right, but as in foolishness, in this confidence of boasting, since many boast according to the flesh, I will boast also. For you, being so wise, tolerate the foolish gladly, for you tolerate it. If anyone enslaves you, anyone devours you, anyone takes advantage of you, anyone exalts himself, anyone hits you in the face, to my shame, I must say that we have been weak by comparison, but in whatever respect anyone else is bold, I speak in foolishness. I am just as bold myself.
Holy moly.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, he sounds like a madman. Like, I'm surprised anyone can take this guy seriously. Like, you read these 3 chapters, he sounds like a mental patient.
Yeah, man.
In my other textbook from this class, there was two main books I had to read. The other one, I want to say it's E.P. Sanders, or it was some other legendary scholar among that rapport that said they've been studying Paul for 30, 40 years now, and the conclusion they have come to after decades of rigorous scholarship and study on Paul is that he literally says Paul is completely unintelligible. He's like, we Pauline scholars, we just can't make sense out of what he was really trying to say. At times, it's like he has a coherent message, but then in another letter, he says stuff that kind of contradicts that message, and he's focusing on other stuff. Sometimes it's these end times prophecies, and we're going to be turned into a Jesus body just like he was. Believe me, it's happening in our lifetime. And then in Romans, it's the law is terrible, and he's just all over the place, and there's no real consistency. And then there's this kind of psychopathic level of bragging and boasting. And it's like, Paul, if you're really the emissary of Jesus, why do you have to boast about yourself so much and justify why you're boasting about yourself so much? Why not just teach the message Jesus is giving you? Isn't that enough?
Right. You'd think there would be a quiet confidence that comes with hanging out with Jesus in private.
Yeah.
You'd be super confident, and you wouldn't care if people called you a liar, and you wouldn't have to boast. You would be totally secure in your faith and in your message.
Yeah,
but
what could give you more
Brad,
security than Jesus appearing to you in these visions?
Right.
Yeah, literally.
I mean, that's psychology 101. Sorry, go ahead, James.
Sorry. I was just going to say, so how would an apologist like Wes Huff read this and all the boasting? Like, what do they say in church? Do they even read verses like this?
Oh, I don't think I've never heard it read in church, but
no, never. Yeah.
But they first of all, they read it with a different tone than I do, and they make it with this kind of righteous sounding. Look at all the sacrifices that Paul made, and how he was. And one thing I've heard him say about specifically about these chapters before is, well, no one would have went through all this persecution if he wasn't sincere. And I'm like, well, it depends on how much money he was making, first of all. But second of all, was he really going through all this persecution? Like, how do we know that he even went through all of this?
So many people have been persecuted for having bad ideas before.
Yeah.
Think about, there's been terrorists, there's been all kinds of political movements that maybe were violent and they were persecuted. So that doesn't automatically make you righteous being persecuted.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a really weak argument, because the logical fallacy is, okay, so anyone who dies for a cause, everything they say is true. Just like Paul, right?
It's kind of like saying anyone who gets angry is justified in their anger. And that's, it's not true, because people get mad all the time for no reason.
Right. Another interesting point based on what we just said about, these passages from Paul almost never get read in church. I certainly never heard these passages where Paul's just on these like chapter long boasting sessions. You never hear these read in church for obvious reasons, because it exposes Paul's character flaws pretty egregiously. But not only, as we say, are 90% of sermons taught on every Sunday in churches around the world based on Paul's teachings and not Yeshua's, I would even argue that the majority of the Pauline messages taught on Sundays are not even from the real Pauline letters, but they almost always come from like the 6 disputed forgeries of Ephesians and Timothy and Titus and so forth, because those are the cleaned up versions of Paul that Orthodox Christians were forging in the late 1st, 2nd century as they were trying to take Paul away from the Gnostics. They're like, we need a Paul in our own image, because if you read Paul's 7 undisputed letters, that like these ones we're reading, scholars agree unanimously, these letters were definitely written by the same author, likely Paul. They're very Gnostic. There's lots of ways you can justify Gnosticism through Paul's original letters. And so the 6 forged letters are very anti-Gnostic works, where they're trying to neuter Paul and tone down his rhetoric, get rid of all those false prophecies he totally whiffed on, and all these other things, right? To clean him up. And those are typically what you hear, because you get these flowery spiritual discourses like in Ephesians and so forth. And so it's okay, there's a Paul that we can accept. Oh, this guy was a wise philosopher. This is great. But when you understand, really no scholars think Paul wrote any of those. If you read the letters he did write, you get a very ugly picture of Paul that your pastor didn't paint for you in church on Sunday.
Yeah, and if you, I mean, just the fact that the undisputed letters are the most problematic, like that tells you something. Like,
there you go, right? Red herring.
yeah. Oh, this is we spoke about this earlier. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if insane. I more so, in far more labors, in far more imprisonments, beaten times without number, oh, often in danger of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods, once was stoned, 3 times I was shipwrecked. At night and a day I have spent in the deep. I have been on frequent journeys in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers from in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers in the sea, dangers among false brethren.
Whoa.
Paul's like Batman, dude. He's getting in scraps, getting beat up all the time, always survives. I mean, how do you live through stoning? You expect me to believe
Yeah.
Paul got stoned and lived to tell about it? You know that stoning is an execution method, right?
Yeah.
You don't stone you just to teach you a lesson.
I got beheaded 7 times.
Yeah.
And he's like, but I did nothing wrong.
Right. It's like, if you don't stop teaching that philosophy, Paul, we're going to behead you again. We'll stone you twice. You can't, no thinking person can be expected to believe Paul was beaten times without number, 5 times beaten with rods, stoned, left for dead, sea shipwrecked. Like, Paul's clearly lying, or at the very least, exaggerating and embellishing.
Yeah.
And look at these criteria Paul begins the passage with. Let me know if these align with the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. Hebrews? Yeah. Israelites? Yeah. Descendants of Abraham? Yeah. Servants of Christ? Yeah. Check, 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 check. So what about the apologetic argument that Paul is not talking about the Jerusalem apostles in these chapters? I mean, this is always the response I get when I have these conversations. They say, oh, no, no, no. Paul was rebuking this faction of Gentile apostles that were trying to infiltrate his ministry. It's this totally arbitrary theory that's made up by apologists with zero evidence whatsoever to corroborate. And if that's true, then what does Paul mean? Are they Hebrews? No, they're Gentiles. Are they Israelites? No, they're Gentiles. The apologetic argument falls apart in this passage. He's literally describing Jewish Christian Nazarenes here, word for word, and then saying, and I'm even better than they are, which again, based on the criterion of similarity, lines up perfectly with all these other passages we've been reading, where he's drawing comparisons with the Jerusalem apostles and saying, and I'm better, or I'm as good as they are. Same rhetoric.
Yep. And there's more. I have been in labor and hardship, through many sleepless nights, and hunger and thirst, often without food, and cold and exposure. Apart from such external things, there is the daily pressure on me of concern for all the churches. Who is weak without my being weak? Who is led into sin without my intense concern? If I have to boast, I will boast of what pertains to my weakness. The God and Father, the Lord Jesus Christ, he who is blessed forever, knows that I'm not lying. There he goes, like invoking God's name again, saying he's not lying. In Damascus, the ethnarch under Aretas, the king, was guarding the city of the Damascenes in order to seize me, and I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall, and so escaped his hand. I highlighted in purple this thing about Damascus and him escaping from it, because this is one of the points that Robert Eisenman brings up. This King Aretas, he was he has some type of a beef with the Herodians about the time of Paul's ministry, and Paul being a Herodian, Eisenman has a theory that this whole issue in Damascus has more to do with Paul's family being at odds with Aretas the king than it has to do with anything that Paul was teaching. And so Paul's essentially using the political machinations of the Herodians and the surrounding kingdoms as evidence of his own persecution, when it was really all, political about his family, not about his, supposed gospel message.
Interesting theory.
Mm.
And so, if that's the case, then all these other things that he's bragging about, whether they're even true, I mean, how much of that would fall under the same category of not really having anything to do with the gospel or any of that, but just to have to do with Paul? Like I made the comment, like, I'm sure none of it's his fault. Like, do we see if he's just out teaching, peace and love your neighbors, yourself, and all that, why are people trying to kill him? Because that doesn't seem like the type of message that will have that much persecution coming after you.
Right.
Now, you start saying you should keep the law, then they might, come after you and try to crucify you. But Paul's gospel is pretty easy to accept for most.
Yeah, and he's not going against the temple cult like Jesus and James were, flipping tables and upsetting the blood sacrifice apple cart. If anything, he's repositioning Christianity to be more in line with the pagan and the Pharisee spirituality. So less controversial.
Well, and that's a good point to bring up about him not having, flipping the tables with the temple cult and all that. If you look at a person's enemies, it tells you a lot about them. So like Jesus and James, they had the same enemies. It was the temple cult, the Pharisees. We know from the death of James, he was taken up on the pinnacle of the temple and thrown down by the temple cult and stoned to death. And so James and Jesus had the same enemies. It wasn't the common people on the street. It wasn't the poor, Judeans that were just struggling to get by. It was the religious leadership. It was the Herodians. It was all these, the upper echelon of society that came against them. Paul was the opposite. When he went into the temple, it wasn't the temple priests that had a problem with him. It was the common people that went after him. So, Paul's enemies were the common people on the street. James and Jesus's enemies were the temple and governmental leadership.
Wow. Yeah. That's a great point. Great point. Populism versus elitism.
Yeah.
Totally, dude. The temple cult killed both Jesus and James. And as we know, Jesus warned us, he said, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Well, Paul is a Pharisee and a Herodian. And one of the ways we know that the Jewish Christians thought Paul was teaching apostasy is that it's in the book of Acts 21, verse 21, which James says to Paul when he's kind of on trial. We've been told about you that you are teaching apostasia, is the Greek word, teaching others to forsake the law of Moses. And Paul isn't written as denying the charges, but it's sort of implied that he denies them, because James says, okay, then to prove that you haven't taught against the law, stay here for the next 7 days and perform the Nazirite vow. And that'll show everyone here that you really do respect the law. And so Paul does it because he's trying to earn the approval, right, of the Jerusalem apostles. But the book of Acts makes it clear that multiple times Paul had to flee for his life to escape being killed by the Jewish Christians. So according to the criterion of embarrassment, if you're trying to make up a hero legend about someone, why would you say that the followers of Jesus were trying to kill him? The Nazarenes in Jerusalem were trying to kill Paul because he was teaching apostasy. You would not make up a detail like that were it not true. You would write that detail if you were trying to smooth it over, which is what the book of Acts is clearly doing. And we know that it's not the accurate historical account because there's all these historical inaccuracies with the book of Acts. So it's weird that apologists will try to make these arguments to me that there was no schism with Paul and the Jerusalem disciples. That's all made up. Well, then why do they also admit, but the Jewish Christians, they all thought Paul was evil and tried to kill him. It's like, okay, but the Jewish Christians were direct students and followers of James and Peter and John. This is the first century when all the disciples are still rocking in the Church of Jerusalem. So if the people that followed them were rejecting Paul, how does that make any sense if they knew that James and Peter and John approved of Paul? And yet they're still rejecting him? They wouldn't do that. They would only reject Paul if they believed that their leaders were rejecting Paul.
And who was it that saved Paul?
The Romans.
The Romans ran into the arms of the Romans. He's like, save me, master.
Yep.
And then where do they take him? They take him to the palace of Agrippa, and he's held in protective custody there in his cousin Agrippa's palace.
Right.
And I think it's funny when he's brought before Agrippa. Agrippa's just talking to him like he's his buddy, like, "Yo, Paul, your learning has about driven you mad," or whatever he says. First name basis. They're just sitting there
Yo,
joking
it's my homie
around
Paul.
and cutting up. Chapter 12, boasting is necessary, though it is not profitable, but I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or out of the body I do not know, God knows, such a man was caught up to the third heaven. And of course, this man is Paul, which is hilarious. And I know how such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, God knows, was caught up to the paradise, into paradise, and heard inexpressible words which a man is not permitted to speak. On behalf of such a man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast, except in regard to my weaknesses. For I do not wish to boast. I will not be foolish, for I will be speaking the truth. But I refrain from this so that no one will credit me with more than he sees in me or hears from me. And then he goes on to tell you that it was him that got these revelations, because he says, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a stinger in the flesh, an angel of Satan, to keep me from exalting myself. And again, it obviously failed. Concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I would rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. And of course, we already went over this earlier in the presentation, but again, it just bears repeating that Paul's sitting here boasting about being possessed by a demon. You have to be pretty boastful to boast about being demon possessed.
I mean, really quick, like Jesus says, when you give to the poor, don't even let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. So that's a pretty strict criteria, right? Even when you do the most benevolent of deeds, don't let it go to your ego. Don't get prideful and boastful about it. Just go on quietly serving the poor with a humble heart. This is what Jesus taught us. And so if Jesus said, don't even boast if you give to the poor, how much less would he want you to boast about anything other than that? It's like, that's the highest possible standard for, there is no reason at all to boast about yourself, let alone in your weaknesses, right? It's false humility.
Well, we got this passage from James that was in the earlier slide, but I just want to compare the color coding here. So, Paul says, my grace is sufficient for you, is supposedly what his Jesus said. James responds, but he gives more grace. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So, they're both invoking this idea of grace. Paul says, I have a stinger in my flesh, an angel of Satan. And James says, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Again, invoking kind of the same idea about demon possession. And then in the purple, the magenta, Paul says that he did this to keep him from exalting himself. And James says, humble yourself in the sight of the Lord and he will exalt you. So
Ouch.
it's hard to believe that these 3 statements are said by James and not meant to be a response to 2 Corinthians, where the counter statement for all of those are located.
Yeah, it's almost like a diatribe. It's almost like a perfect mirrored response between what Paul is saying and between what Paul is saying and how James is responding to it.
Yeah. Therefore, I am well content with weakness, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I have become foolish. You yourselves compelled me. There's that famous narcissistic projection there. And it's not my fault that I was foolish. You caused me to be foolish. You yourselves compelled me. Actually, I should have been commended by you. For in no respect was I inferior to the most super apostles. Even though I am a nobody, the signs of a true apostle were performed among you with all perseverance by signs and wonders and miracles. And let's don't tell anybody, but Matthew 24 says, do not believe signs and miracles and wonders as a sign
that's
of a
not
true
a sign of an
apostle.
apostle.
Yeah. For in what respect were you treated as inferior to the rest of the churches, except that I myself did not become a burden to you? Forgive me this wrong. So from this point, I flip over to James, and we see what James has to say about these 3 chapters of continuous boasting and arrogance. James 3:1, let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will incur a stricter judgment, for we all stumble in many ways. If anybody does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. Now we put the bits into the horses' mouths so that they will obey us. We direct their entire body as well. Look at the ships also, though they are so great and driven by strong winds, and are still directed by a very small rudder wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of many things.
Wow.
So poetic and beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Epistle of James, man, it's just beautiful text.
The best.
Yeah, I mean, after reading Paul for the last 10 slides, to switch over to James is like a breath of fresh air.
Seriously.
It's like a cold glass of water on a hot day.
Yeah. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our life, and is set on fire by hell. For every species of beast and birds and reptiles and creatures of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by the human race, but no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men. We already talked about that at the beginning of Galatians, but bears repeating here. Who have been made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessings and cursings. My brethren, these things ought not to be this way. Does a fountain send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, or a vine produce figs? Nor can salt water produce fresh. Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy, selfish ambition in your heart, and do not boast, and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. Ouch. For where bitter jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceful, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy, and the seed of whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace.
Incredible.
There's so many ways that connects exactly what Paul was saying. I mean, Paul spent 3 chapters just going insane with his boastful nature, and then James just comes in and totally deflates it all in 3 pages.
Yeah, it's a clear argument. You know a tree by its fruit. You can't just say, oh, if anyone says something that's true, they must be representing Jesus. Like, this is how the negative polarity, the demonic, the darkness operates. They go around teaching 90% truth because that's how they get you. They want the gullible neophytes who hear the 90% truth to overlook the 10% distortion and inversion. No evil being goes around just espousing evil doctrines because they know that everyone will be like, that's evil, and run away from them. So they do it with clever craftiness, and they disguise it with light. And so just because Paul says some things that we would all agree with and say, yeah, that's right, that's true, in no way legitimizes the rest of Paul's teachings or Paul himself. It's like even the demons know truth and use truth to their advantage to suck people into their schemes. So we have to look at the fruit of somebody to know if they are truly walking in the light. And when you weigh Paul against the gold standard of Jesus, I'm sorry, he doesn't even come close. He's not even in the same galaxy as Jesus. And that's all I need to know to say, look, I'm not going to trust this guy over the teachings of Jesus themselves. I already have Jesus's teachings. That's good enough for me.
Amen.
Yeah. I mean, really just looking at verse 14, if you have bitter jealousy, did we see bitter jealousy in Paul's letters in 2 Corinthians and in
Sure did.
Galatians? Getting up in Peter's face and arguing with him. Selfish ambition. We saw him wanting to promote himself above the other apostles. I'm not the least inferior to them. I mean,
Are they
that's
Hebrews? So am I.
Yeah. Do not boast and so lie against the truth. I mean, he was calling them false apostles and servants of Satan. Like everything that James says in verse 14 perfectly fits what we just read from Paul. And in 2 Peter 3, was talking about this earlier, this so-called endorsement of Paul. Peter says, and our beloved brother Paul, who writes to you according to the wisdom given to him. Notice that Peter never says who gave him the wisdom. And James is sitting here saying there's two kinds of wisdom. One type of wisdom is demonic. And the demonic wisdom is the bitter jealousy, selfish ambition, the boasting and lying against the truth. That he says that's not what comes down from above. This is earthly, natural, demonic. And I really think the evidence points toward this being the source of Paul's wisdom. And this is why I think Peter doesn't credit God with his wisdom. He doesn't say according to the wisdom given to him by God. He just says according to wisdom given to him.
Wow.
James 4:1, what is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasures. You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. This referral to the adulteresses, in my mind, it invoked Revelation 2:20. He says, just Jesus speaking, but I have this against you, that you tolerate your woman, Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess. She teaches and seduces my servants to commit sexual immorality and to eat things sacrificed to idols. Who else is teaching them these things sacrificed to idols? He says, I gave her time to repent, but she refused to repent of her sexual immorality. Behold, I will throw her into a bed, and those who commit adultery with her into great oppression, unless they repent of her works. So this eating food sacrificed to idols is compared to adultery. And I really feel like that, I don't know, that verse 4, you adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? I mean, I think that in the first century, what would friendship with the world be represented more accurately by, other than this participating of the world system, eating the meat sacrificed to idols and that sort of thing?
Yeah. He's clearly speaking of a spiritual adultery. You claim to be you claim to believe in God, but then you fornicate with the world or you follow the world's ways. It's like a type of spiritual adultery.
And it's so prevalent today, like the spiritual genius of this. See, it goes straight into the future. Look at America today. Everyone's on their phones watching, people twerking, hypersexualized society, fornication, and this demonic factory farming system that everyone has spiritually and mentally become divorced from, where they're supporting pure evil every day, 3 times a day, without even thinking about it. So these same demonic influences, they have their same inroads into humanity's hearts back then as they do today. Maybe the technology has changed a bit, but it's the same spirit.
Well, and there's that letter from Pliny the Younger to Trajan. This is supposedly the first evidence that we have of Christian persecution. And what was Pliny doing? He was forcing them to eat eat flesh sacrificed to idols, and
Right.
he was killing Christians if they would not eat the sacrificial meat. And so today, like back then, Christians were giving their life to avoid eating meat, but then today you
Yeah.
just even suggest to somebody that you should maybe not do that, and they lose their mind about it.
Yeah.
Or do you think that the Scripture speaks to no purpose? He jealously desires the Spirit which he has made to dwell in us, but he gives a greater grace. Therefore it says, God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be miserable, and mourn, and weep, lest your laughter be turned into mourning, and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the presence of the Lord, and he will exalt you. Okay, before we finish up, I just wanted to go back and address this whole accusation of thievery that we see with Paul. 2 Corinthians 12:14, this is the third time I'm ready to come to you. I will not be a burden to you, for I seek not your possessions, but you. For the children ought not to save up for the parents, but the parents for the children. I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. If I love you more abundantly, am I loved the less? But be it so. I did not myself burden you, but being craftily, I caught you with deception. Did I take advantage of you by any one of them whom I've sent to you? I exhorted Titus and sent the brother with him. Did Titus take any advantage of you? Didn't we walk in the same spirit? Didn't we walk in the same steps? So again, Paul is defending himself against accusations of taking the offerings and deceiving his congregations, taking advantage of the people. And then he
Which he
concludes
admits to doing.
Which what? Be stealing?
Which he admitted to doing in was it Galatians?
Yeah, he did.
I robbed other churches to support you.
Right. Yeah, he admitted in Galatians. He also talks about it in 1 Corinthians also, which I think I have a slide with that. And then he finishes up by saying, this is the third time I've coming to you. So both, he mentions twice he's coming to him the third time. And then this is 1 Corinthians 9. Paul says, my defense to those who examine me is this: have we no right to eat and drink? Have we no right to take a wife who's a believer, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord in Kepha? Or have only Barnabas and I no right not to work? What soldier ever serves at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and doesn't eat its fruit? Or who feeds a flock and doesn't drink from the flock's milk? So he's obviously being accused of taking profit from the offerings from these congregations.
Yeah.
Now he goes on to say, but I didn't do this. And it's like, really? Because you sure are defending yourself a lot for someone who, like, why would he say all this about, don't I have the right to do this?
Yeah, I mean, textual critics who study Pauline scholars, one of the things they do is they look at all the things Paul defends himself against to know and understand historically what were the things that the churches he was ministering to were accusing him of. Why did he have such a scandalous reputation in the first century? And you can answer those questions pretty easily just by reading Paul's letters like this and see all the things he's defending himself against. And it's like, if this guy was totally innocent, maybe not every single accusation is true. I think they probably all were, but let's say they weren't. Just a few of them are true. It's like, is there any chance that none of them were true? Give me a break.
Right.
You don't earn a reputation like this to where you have to constantly defend yourself from many different types of accusations, by the way, if none of it's true and you're just this good old boy who does no wrong, like Paul paints himself out to be.
Yeah, I mean, like, look, if he didn't take any of the money that he wasn't supposed to, why didn't he just say that? Like, why would he go into this? Have we no right to eat or drink?
Justify.
Yeah.
He's basically saying, I didn't take it, I deserve it.
So what he said there in 1 Corinthians 13, where he's talking about, going to such and such a city, this, I think, is what James is referring to here. He says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage ourselves and make profit. yet you don't know what your life will be like tomorrow. You're just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Therefore, to one who knows the right to do and doesn't do it, to him it is a sin. But then this next passage where James is like, I think this is him responding to Paul bringing up this accusation about taking from the offerings. He says, come now, you rich, and weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a testimony against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up your treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you have kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of those who reaped have entered into the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived delicately in the earth and have taken your pleasure. You have nourished your hearts as a day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the righteous one. He doesn't resist you.
Wow.
I think this is the one time that I really think that James almost you see some emotion. Like I think he sounds almost angry here. Like Paul's kind of I'll go back a couple of slides. You know, he's making these statements about did I myself burden you? Did I take advantage of you? Did Titus take any advantage of you? Like he's kind of denying that he did this thing, but I think that James knows he was doing it. And I think it kind of like maybe take James off a little bit.
Well, you can understand if this guy's going around being like, hey, what's up, y'all? I'm an apostle from Jerusalem, signed off by James the Just himself.
Yeah.
And then you're like stealing money from the offerings. That's going to look bad on James, right? He's like, yo, dude, this is not something I would ever commission someone to do. Like he's going to have a good reason to rebuke Paul for doing that. And, or at least a good reason for trying to smooth his reputation over of like, hey, I don't pass off on this kind of behavior. And it seems like he might be doing that here, right?
Yeah. Well, this last line, you have murdered the righteous one. He doesn't resist you. Eisenman believes this righteous one, he's speaking about himself. He's basically prophesying that the person he's speaking to is going to murder him. James the just, James the righteous one.
Wow.
Cameron Waters, he actually brought up a document a few nights ago to me. He sent me a text about Dorotheus of Tyre, and he wrote this document. The synopsis, sometimes it's referred to as a synopsis epistolorum. And basically it's a document where he talks about all the 12 apostles and James. But there's a variant reading in the Greek manuscript where he records that James was taken up to the pinnacle of the temple by the Jews, and as Abdius writes, was thrown down by Saul, afterwards called Paul, and having breath after his fall, one came with a fuller's club and knocked him on the head and brained him. And Dorotheus also says that Eusebius wrote the same thing. So in the version of Eusebius we have now, it doesn't say that Paul threw him down. It says that just some of the Jews took him up on the temple and threw him down. But I'm wondering if this kind of this variant reading from Dorotheus, if there's some truth to it, because why would someone add Paul's name in there if it wasn't there already? Like, you're much more likely to remove Paul's name if you're an early church father, church historian, or something.
Right. Which we know Rufinus did that in the Clementine writings.
Yeah.
Changing Saul to Simon Magus. But even the Ascents of James, which is one of the earliest Jewish Christian texts we have. I've read an entire scholarly work on the Ascents of James, where the scholar, it's Van Voorst, shows pretty convincingly that this is a pre-70 text because it speaks of a standing temple. It has no allusions or mentions at all of anything to do with Catholic orthodoxy or later church traditions, or even the Greek New Testament. It has no writings at all about the Greek Gospels we have today. It doesn't seem to know any of the books from the New Testament or Roman Orthodoxy. It's written as if it's pre all of that, when there's just the Jewish Orthodoxy opposing the Jewish Christians at the very beginning of the movement. And the temple still standing puts it in 70. And what does the ascents of James say happened? It says that Saul throws, Simon Nagus, of course, but Saul throws James down and attacks him and all of that. And we know that the Clementine writings were highly interpolated and altered. And likely they changed the fact that they actually did kill James, that event in the ascents of James is actually the martyrdom of James. But it says that, oh, and then they all survived and they escaped and took James away. But then after that, there's no mention of James ever again. So it's like, I bet that probably was James' death. And some later scribe was like, ooh, we don't want to make Saul look bad here, that he killed James. So let's say that James actually survived this one. But it's clearly the same encounter we read from Josephus and Eusebius of the death of James in the temple.
Mm-hmm.
So there's multiple attestations putting charge at fault for that. And that's powerful evidence.
It seems like that somebody also mentions, like some historian mentions, that Josephus wrote that Saul killed James in the War of the Jews, but it's not there now. Like in the copy of Josephus we have now, it's not in there. I can't remember who that source was, but somebody, there's a lot of quotations we have from early historians that quote Josephus to read a certain way. But then when you actually look at Josephus, it doesn't read that way anymore. So
yeah,
somebody's obviously done some tampering with the text, and I think it's so naive the way some people have this view of the Bible, like it's never been tampered with. Like if they would tamper with Josephus, they've certainly tampered with the Bible.
Oh man, the Bible is the most tampered text to ever exist, and it's not close. It's not close. The Quran, not close. Book of Mormon, not close. The Bible is by far the most changed, altered, edited, interpolated book to exist on this planet.
Well, I was trying to remove the share screen.
So is that it?
Yeah, that's it. That's the last slide.
Okay. So wow, what a journey.
Yeah.
Thank you, David, for taking us through so many of Paul's writings there. I know this was one of our longer episodes, but as with any dense topic, this one takes time to really sift through it. It's one of those things that I find funny when, I post a reel or whatever, and Christians come on and they've never heard any of these arguments about Paul and the great schism, as scholars call it. And they'll say like, oh, give me one piece of proof that James didn't approve of Paul or something. And it's like, oh yeah, let me just summarize this in an Instagram comment for you.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
It takes hours of sifting through the evidence and discussing the context and the weight of the evidence to show these arguments and do their justice, because there is so much evidence that it isn't a quick conversation to have. And this is part 2 of us bringing you on to have this conversation. And yet still, we could sit here for another 3 hours and rattle off proofs and arguments against Paul's illegitimacy as an apostle. And so I guess I would just wrap up before I give you guys the final closing thoughts by saying, although we do a lot of this Paul bashing, we want to be clear, like, we love Paul as a brother in Christ. It's nothing against Paul personally. The reason we go hard about this is because Paul's writings have been used to create this behemoth of a religion that we know today as Christianity, which we believe on this show is one of the most powerful strongholds of the negative polarity on this planet, and for hijacking and erasing and covering up the true teachings of Jesus. All this mess got started with Paul's writings. And so if we're going to resurrect the true gospel of Jesus and give the teachings of Jesus the prominence they deserve, we have to go back and correct the record of where did it all go astray. And we've been brought up in this culture, in church, in Judeo-Christianity in this country, that says all these teachings come from Jesus. This is Jesus's teachings that Paul's giving. And so it takes a lot of this kind of sifting to show people this is provably false, that Paul represents Jesus in any kind of way. And so, again, if we want to follow Jesus and do our due diligence, we do have to go back and correct the things that deserve to be corrected. So we hope that nobody, whether you're Christian or not, takes this as we have some kind of personal vendetta against Paul. I really don't. I would love to meet the guy and have a dinner conversation with him. Oh my goodness, I would cherish such an opportunity. It just so happens that this is where it all went wrong. And so we have to correct the problem where the problem began. And so with that, I'll pitch to you, James, for any final thoughts you have, and then you, David.
Sure. Well, first of all, David, thank you for an absolutely epic presentation. So just the dichotomy between Paul and James is so powerful when you lay it out like that. I just want to communicate to the audience that we're extremely passionate about reviving the teachings of Jesus. And if we're, sometimes it might come across like we're making a mocking voice of Paul or something like that. But all we're doing is showing this dichotomy in the energy and the teachings between Paul and James and Jesus. And when you read enough of Paul and understand the context, you will come to see and understand that this is an accurate portrayal of the tone that he's actually delivering this message. Like we're not mocking him. This is actually accurate in my estimation of how he's talking about the apostles and how he's talking about his situation, how he's boasting over and over again. So I guess I just wanted to stress that this is not some kind of mean-spirited thing, but what we believe is a very accurate representation of what Paul was communicating.
Yeah. It's our attempt to take Paul off the pedestal that Christianity's placed him on and had kind of elevated him to the status of a god. And everything Paul said is infallible from God. It's like, not only is that not true, here's what he actually said and what he actually meant. And you kind of do need to see the contrast of what you've been taught versus the reality. This guy boasting about himself, mocking the disciples, cursing people who disagree with him. Like it deserves to be caricatured a little bit so we can accept the reality of the situation.
We're talking about, unfortunately and sadly, and we've all encountered it in our lives, a disturbed individual, an individual with a lot of trauma, someone who had hurt people. You know what that does to someone's psyche to kill someone? That can break someone's psyche. And he, to his own admission, was dealing with demonic influence or possession. So just like anyone you would encounter in life who's engaging in evil or is dealing with demonic possession, there's a degree of empathy and sympathy because someone's very much lost in darkness. And it's like, my goodness, even people who are committing evil in the world right now with all this horrible geopolitical stuff, part of me feels terrible for them. It's like, my goodness, if they knew what they were doing to their souls, if they knew that they were harming their souls like this, I feel pity and sadness for them. So in that same context, I feel a lot of sadness for Paul, what he may have done to his soul with distorting the teachings of the greatest spiritual teacher who ever lived.
Well said.
Thanks.
David?
Yeah, I will. I'll just say this: like when we did the first presentation together, there were a lot of people in the comments making the comment that the apostles accepted Paul, and he was obviously one of them, and they didn't question his authority or whatnot. And I hope that we've kind of shown that that's not the case. Just saying that someone shook your hand doesn't mean that they are accepting you as an apostle or a leader in the assembly or anything like that. I think the evidence in Paul's own writings shows that he was at best an outlier, definitely not part of the inner circle, and at times he was pretty much rejected. Otherwise, he wouldn't be constantly defending himself against being rejected. So it's not as cut and dry as we like to think it was. Even the book of Acts doesn't necessarily paint him as being totally accepted, just as they allowed him to speak. He came to the meeting and they were just not jerks to him. They treated him like anyone. Like if you went to a church today, they're going to greet you at the door. They're going to let you come in. Maybe if you're going to Sunday school, they'll let you talk. They're not going to be a jerk to you. And just because the apostles treated Paul the same way doesn't mean that they agreed with, that they knew everything he taught and could perfectly agreed with it. There were obviously problems there, and the church doesn't like to address the problems. They don't like to even accept what Paul says at times. And so what we're doing here is we're just kind of pulling out these problem texts that the church doesn't like to, preach from the pulpit, and just saying, hey, have you thought about this? Have you thought about the implications of what Paul's saying in this verse? And when you start thinking about those implications, then you should start seeing some things to concern you. So,
Amen.
that's it.
Yeah.
Real quick, Aaron, it reminds me of, we've had events before where you had an open mic and someone took the mic and hogged it and preached something that we totally this has literally happened before.
Mhm.
Now, if that person goes around and saying they had the right hand of fellowship and they're, an endorsement, when they
Yeah.
really just hijacked the meeting and totally embarrassed themselves and embarrassed us to a degree. So it seems like a similar situation.
That's a great point. Imagine how inconvenient the world would be if everyone that you were kind to or shook their hand means you agree with everything they believe and say, they've got your full pass. That'd be a rough world to live in, man.
Well,
Mhm.
even Paul admits that when he was there for that conference, that they pulled him aside privately and talked to him about something. And so I think that it probably wasn't as comfortable and friendly a meeting as Paul acted like it was. So
Yeah, certainly not. And, as we said in our first episode, Jesus said very plainly, my sheep know my voice, and the voice of another they will not follow. And then in John 5:31, this is the most, to me, damning indictment against Paul. Jesus says, if I testify about myself, my testimony is not true. So if even Jesus doesn't pass testifying about himself, how much less should we pass on Paul testifying about himself? That's
Yeah.
just circular reasoning. And this is all you really get when you address this with Christians of, give me one reason why I should accept Paul's private visions as legitimate. Well, because Paul said, and Paul was anointed. Right, that's my point. No man can be the witness and claimant to their own claim. No one can testify to themselves. Jesus said this plainly. So again, why do we even need to argue about all this? Why do we need to debate about was Paul legitimate or not? Let's just shut it all down and just focus on the teachings of Jesus. Isn't that the easy solution? And
Yep.
of course, that's the solution we are recommending on this podcast. So, David, again, thank you for joining us today and taking us through that amazing presentation. We'll definitely have you back on for a Paul Part 3 very soon.
Okay. Sounds good.
And thank you, James, as well, for adding all your wisdom to today's conversation, as always. And thank you guys for watching today's episode, and we hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for sticking through an extra long one. And until next time, as always, get out there and love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself, because that's the Jesus way. And we'll see you on the next episode of the Jesus Way podcast. Peace and love, y'all.